Welcome to the 5th edition of the International Dairy Federation Nutritional Health Symposium. My name is Laurence Rijken and I'm the Director General, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to this event. So IDF has been established since 1903 and we are the leading source of scientific and technical expertise to all stakeholders across the dairy chain. And with a vast network of 1,200 experts spanning 40 member countries around the globe, IDF proudly represents 2/3 of the global milk production. And our mission is to help nourish the world with safe, nutritious, and sustainable dairy foods. And through that trusted and enduring source of authoritative science and technical information, we are able to develop standards, practices, and regulations that ensure the continued success of the dairy sector. And as you can see from the slide, we are really across all topics within the value chain. For the 5th edition of this Nutrition and Health Symposium, we aim to take a deep dive in the role of dairy and plant-sourced foods for nutrition and healthy diets. Recently, the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization released a joint statement on what healthy diets are. And healthy diets promote health, growth, and development, support active lifestyles, prevent nutrient deficiencies and excesses, communicable and non-communicable diseases, foodborne diseases, and promote well-being. It's very important to note that there is no one diet that fits all, and they outline the 4 principles: adequate, balanced, moderate, and diverse are the key components of a healthy diet. And dairy is part of healthy diets. And as you can see in the slides, they cover all healthy diets principles as I outlined before. Dairy foods, including milk, yogurt, and cheese, are an integral part of food-based dietary guidelines due to their significant nutritional, health, and socioeconomic contributions, as you can see on the slide. So we have published some resources on this regard, highlighting the contribution of dairy as part of these healthy diets. You can see them here, and you can find them on our IDF website. And I'm pleased to announce the release of a new publication, From Protein Transition to Food System Transition: Dairy's Holistic Role in Sustainable Food Systems. And so the fact sheet analyzes the narrow focus of the so-called protein transition, which emphasizes replacing animal proteins with plant alternatives, often overlooking broader impacts, really looking at that sole lens of protein, but not all the other elements. And the fact sheet shows the need for broader food system transition, an approach that balances health, environmental, cultural, and economic goals. And dairy is showed as a key contributor to sustainable diets due to its nutrient density, cultural relevance, and role in rural livelihoods. Please take a look at the fact sheet. And in the context of the theme of this symposium, I would like to emphasize the importance of recognizing the general standard for use of dairy terms. So the Codex Alimentarius has done standards which defines milk. And milk is defined as a normal mammary secretion of milking animals obtained from one or more milkings without either addition to it or extraction from it, intended for consumption as liquid milk or for further processing. And dairy terms such as cheese and yogurt are also covered by this standard, as they are derived directly from milk. So the importance of having clear and accurate use of terminology helps prevent consumer confusion. All the information can be found in our IDF bulletin. So as I mentioned, this is the 5th edition of the Nutrition and Health Symposium. And you can find materials for the other past symposia on our website and on the IDF YouTube channel. And the previous events covered the topics such as food-based dietary guidelines, dairy matrix, and the role of dairy during the life course. And we had some very incredible lineups also for these events. Every year we have a flagship event, the IDF World Dairy Summit. And this year we're very proud to go for the very first time to Latin America, and we will be in Chile. And we will involve global leaders, dairy experts, scientists, technical specialists, farmers, and more to bring the latest and the most significant issues facing the global dairy sector. So all the documents I showed before and many others can be found on our publication web page on the IDF website. So please take a look and you'll find the link in the chat. And if you want to stay up to date with our work, sign up for our email newsletter on the IDF site, and you can also find us on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube, where we regularly share updates on our work. My final slide is to thank all of those who have contributed to the organization of this webinar, as well all of you who are participating and following it online. And I will now give the floor to Dr. Lynette Neufeld, Director Food and Nutrition Division of FAO, who will provide the opening remarks.
Good morning. I'm sorry that I'm not there with you today. I'd like to take a few moments to talk about healthy diets and the context in which we consume them. As you all know, healthy diets are a common cause of all forms of malnutrition and undermine human capital through their influence on survival, health, development, and their influence on non-communicable diseases and related death. Underneath all of those indicators that we track, they really are only the tip of the malnutrition iceberg. It's been estimated that 1.6 billion women and preschool-aged children are deficient in one or more micronutrients, this affecting all world regions. Despite years of improvement, well, some years of improvement, 1/3 of the people in the world, about 2.8 billion, are unable to afford a healthy diet. Let's just take a moment to talk about what a healthy diet is. There are often mixed messages and sometimes even contradictory messages in the media and even in the literature. Based on this issue, last year, together with WHO, we published an evidence-based review of the principles that underlie a healthy diet and their implications for humans, not the broader issues related to the quality of our food and the environmental impacts, but based on human biology. What is a healthy diet for human biology? What we found is that the evidence supports that healthy diets must meet 4 simple principles. They must be adequate in nutrients without excess, balanced in energy and its sources from carbohydrates, fats, and protein, diverse in foods among and within food groups, and moderate in the consumption of unhealthy foods and dietary components. Obviously, healthy diets are made up of foods that are safe. While these principles are universal, dietary patterns are highly variable by context and should and are influenced by a variety of considerations beyond human health. This is to say, the combination of foods that we consume over time and in our context, this is our dietary pattern. National food-based dietary guidelines are a tool to articulate what that healthy dietary pattern looks like. And they are developed based on local considerations, including preferences, traditions, availability, affordability, but they can and should also be developed with considerations of the sustainability of food production, equity of access, among other factors. This year, we will be publishing a new guidance document, which is being referred to as food systems-based dietary guidelines. And the document will support countries in bringing those considerations into the development of their dietary guidelines. With this, I want to take a moment to talk about 2 important related messages. First of all, there is no such a thing as a single superfood. The healthfulness of what we eat lies in the combinations of foods that we consume in our diets and over time. That said, some foods do pose greater risk or may provide particular benefits to the healthfulness of diet. With relation to animal source foods, and particularly terrestrial animal source foods, a couple of years ago now, we published this report that summarized the state of the evidence by type of animal source food, terrestrial animal source food, for health benefits. And you can see here that there is, for example, substantial evidence of positive nutrition and health outcomes across all stages for milk and dairy products, some evidence related to nutrient intake for women from eggs, and also for child growth in some contexts, and for meat related to iron status in adults, and in some contexts, lean muscle mass in older adults. But the review also identified health risks, particularly related to the consumption, any consumption of processed red meat, and for unprocessed red meat, even some risk related to intakes beyond certain threshold. For other animal source foods, the evidence was either non-significant or inconclusive. There are several areas where there is insufficient data to really be able to make those strong conclusions. Terrestrial animal source foods are also a unique source of a variety of nutrients. It depends obviously on the type of animal source foods, and the importance of those nutrients depends on the life stage. So again, coming back to the importance of certain foods that may bring additional benefit, for example, based on their nutrient composition. FAO is now exploring the current state of evidence on the role of animal source food alternatives across a variety of domains. These have been categorized into different types, whether they're plant, fungi, algae, cell, or insect-based. And the reviews will cover topics such as nutrition, in this instance, as compared to their animal source food that they are intending to replace, as well as environment, livelihoods, affordability, safety, and acceptability considerations. This is a series of commissioned evidence reviews, and internally we have put together a cross-disciplinary task force or working group to consider the implications of the current state of evidence for the work that we do across these variety of domains related to nutrition, environment, livelihoods of agriculture and food systems, etc. So to conclude, healthy diets meet 4 simple universal principles. Many dietary patterns can be healthy and are dependent on the variety of local, cultural, economic, environmental, and other considerations. Some individual foods may pose particular health risks or health benefits, but ultimately it is our long-term dietary pattern that is essential to maximize our health benefit and ensure that what we eat can be contributing to other goals, such as sustainability of production in the long term. And with that, I will leave you to your deliberation and wish you a good meeting. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Rodrigo Valenzuela. I am doctor in nutrition and health and food science and nutrition. I am professor and director in the nutrition department in the Faculty of Medicine in the University of Chile. Thank you very much by considering my name as moderator in this IDF Nutrition and Health Symposium 2025. Well, before to start this exposition, I want to share with you the important information. Before going into the presentation, I would like to mention some of housekeeping aspects. This event is being recorded and you will get the recording. Second point, please type question into the Q&A function because I will be asking you the question during the general panel discussion. And you can use the option transcript to read subtitle. This possibilities is very good for you, and is in the case if you don't have the good domain of the English. Okay, please type the question into the Q&A function. Yeah. Well, in this conference we will have the possibility to listen the next exposition. But before this, it's important to see that information. Attendance certificate, professional development accreditation. You can get an attendance for CPD certificate upon request in this email if you are from Canada, South Africa, UK, or US. Canadian dietitian can come the Symposium. South African practitioner can earn in total 5 to CPD, and this information is for this specific country, okay? If you're from Canada, South Africa, UK, or United States, in this email, you can obtain that certification. Well, in our program, in the session 2, I am the moderator. We can to save the next exposition, and the speaker balancing sustainable and nutrition, the impact of reducing animal source food and micronutrient adequacy. Dr. Thibault, Global Alliance for Improvement Nutrition Guide. Nutritional difference between milk and plant-based beverage by Professor Hassan Batersparat, College of Pharmacy and Nutrition, University of Saskatchewan, Canada. Beyond Dairy, Evaluating Accessibility, Calcium and Plant-Based Source by Dr. Molly Muleya, Nottingham University, United Kingdom. Transition to Plant-Rich Diet, Protein Quality, Dr. Susan Hodgkinson, Massey University, New Zealand. Imagine Cause Milk Allergy in 25 Milk Leaders, Professor Karina Wenter, University of Colorado, United States. And then we will finally with the exposition of the contribution of dairy and plant-based foods to nutrition and health in Japan. Professor Seiichiro Aoi, Otsuma Women's University, Japan. Well, welcome again to the important symposium from IDF in Nutrition and Health 25, and I hope you can enjoy this exposition.
Hello, everyone. It's good to be here. I'll be talking about balancing sustainability in nutrition, with a particular focus on how reducing animal source foods influences micronutrient adequacy. So I'll talk a little bit about the burden of micronutrient malnutrition, look at why nutrient inadequacies exist in different ways in high-income countries versus lower-income countries, look at the unique nutritional role of animal source foods, and lastly, the role of sustainable diets. So we see these numbers probably more frequently now. A vast amount of people worldwide are deficient in micronutrients. This study from just a few years ago demonstrated that over 1 in 2 preschool-age children and 2 in 3 women of reproductive age have at least one micronutrient deficiencies. And many of these women have more than one at the same time, as well as the children. So we can see very high prevalence in some countries, especially when we're looking at sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. In some countries, up to 9 in 10 women have deficiencies. So most people in these populations are deficient in at least one nutrient. What's also surprising oftentimes is that we also see a high prevalence of deficiency even in higher income contexts. So not as high, but pretty prevalent, as you can see here. For women in the UK, 1 in 2, and for women in the US, 1 in 3. And when we look at just iron deficiency, about 1 in 5 women in both the UK and the US are deficient. In the UK, you could also add vitamin D and folate to that list at about 1 in 5 women. Now, this is showing the same data, but at the regional level. And what I'd like to just highlight is that all regions show a pretty high prevalence. So some areas like sub-Saharan Africa, we see up to 80%. But even in the high-income context, it's nearly half of the population on average have at least one of those deficiencies. Now, deficiencies themselves certainly have consequences to health. One of the more severe consequences is anemia. And this is often caused by iron deficiency and other nutrient deficiencies as well. And so we can see a very high prevalence, about Over a third of women and children probably worldwide have anemia, and in some areas it's up to 2 in 3. So very high burden, and the severity, of course, varies, but overall there's a high prevalence of anemia worldwide. Now, when we look at diets, we also see some similar staggering numbers here, and it doesn't correspond perfectly, but we see inadequacies in the diet as well. So when we look at overall estimates of what quantity of nutrients the population is consuming, we see big gaps for vitamin E, about 5 billion people, calcium and iron. So really high prevalence. This is over half the population. For some of these nutrients, it's about 2/3 of the population. And these are showing that diets are not providing the nutrients that are required for health. So what is the cause of these inadequacies? What's going on in the different contexts? And what we'll see here is in high-income context, we see unhealthy foods that are displacing more nutritious foods. So these foods on the right here. Now, these are often referred to as ultra-processed foods. Now, not all ultra-processed foods are nutrient poor, but many of them are. So when we look at patterns around the world geographically, we can see in North America, in Europe, in Australia, New Zealand, we see that's where the largest amount of ultra-processed foods is. So in these contexts, over half of the diet is actually made up of these nutrient-poor ultra-processed foods. And so they're displacing more nutritious foods. So that has consequences not just for the risk of chronic diseases, but also for nutrient adequacy and nutrient deficiencies. Now, when we look in the lower income context, it's not that there's as high of a consumption of ultra-processed foods. We saw that, although that is increasing. And so that's increasing concern because the lower income countries are starting to consume more and more ultra-processed foods that are also nutrient poor. But the bigger issue here is just a lack of access to nutritious foods. And so obviously people want to consume more, but they can't afford them. Cost is a huge barrier, or they can't access them in the market. They don't have a lot of options. And so we see people lack really diversity of foods. And so when we look at a dietary indicator that reflects risk of nutrient inadequacy, we can see here minimum dietary diversity for women, which was just recently adopted formally by the UN as an indicator of zero hunger, SDG 2. And we see quite a difference in prevalence from 24% up to 91%. And the regions with the biggest challenge with dietary diversity, which reflects nutrient adequacy, is really in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia primarily. So in Ethiopia, just 24% of the population consumes adequate dietary diversity. Now, there are many essential nutrients, but when we zoom in on a handful or so of these commonly lacking deficiencies, nutrients that are often priority in lower income contexts, here's where we see some of the top sources. And we're looking at this graph. On the left side is looking at the quantity required in calories to provide an average of a third of the recommended intakes across these 6 nutrients. And the right side is showing the quantity in grams. And so basically, the smaller the bar, the higher the nutrient density of that food group. And that's also demonstrated via the color coding. So we see the darker green having higher nutrient density. So which foods are really the top source of these priority micronutrients? Well, it's often animal source foods, especially the organ meats like liver. We also see a lot of seafood and fish, so small dried fish, which could be freshwater or seafood. We see bivalves, so clams, mussels, oysters, crustaceans like shrimp and other shellfish. And then we also see ruminant meat like beef, eggs, and dairy products. Now, on the plant source side, we see dark green leafy vegetables, one of the most nutrient-dense sources of these nutrients, And if we were to add a broader set of micronutrients, we'd see also that other non-starchy vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds are also really good sources of these micronutrients. So zooming in on animal source foods, what is unique about these? Well, we can see that they really provide the only intrinsic source of retinol, heme iron, vitamins B12, and vitamin D. And this is important because when you consume these in animal sources, they're typically more bioavailable, to the extent where vitamin B12 is really not available in plant sources at all. And so animal source foods are the only source of that nutrient. Certain mushrooms have some vitamin D3, depending on how they're produced, but it's not a common source. And then the form of the nutrient as well, such as iron or zinc, when you consume that nutrient through animal source foods, they're typically more bioavailable because of the type of form. So heme iron compared to non-heme iron, but also the anti-nutrients like phytate, oxalate, etc. And so in general, we see a higher, not only a higher density of some of these nutrients, but a more absorbable form for the body. And then the rest of this slide really just highlights, protein is also typically of higher quality in animal source foods, the exception being soy products, which are also really good complete sources of protein as well. And then looking in at DHA and EPA, these long-chain omega-3s, they're really some of the top sources of those as well, except for sea vegetables, which are not widely available. And lastly, I'll just highlight that there are other beneficial compounds. Now, these are not always considered essential, but things like creatine, anserine, taurine, etc. can really contribute to health. So when we look around the world again, where are animal source foods consumed? Well, we can see here overall in the world, there's over 2 servings per day. In Central or Eastern Europe and Central Asia, up to 5 servings per day. Now, it's important to note that unprocessed poultry meat is not included here. So that would change this a little bit. Now, at the bottom, we see South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, as low as 1 serving per day or less. And so many of these countries, people are not even consuming 1 serving of animal source foods, which is low even by the Eat Lancet standards. And so many of these countries could really benefit from increasing consumption. So when we're thinking about in the context of sustainable diets, that often means limiting or moderating the amount of animal source foods. Now, while that's definitely a good strategy in general for sustainability and health, it can increase some risks for deficiencies or inadequacies. And so what we see here is that, looking at the Eat Lancet diet, for example, which contains about 14% of calories from animal sources, we run into some gaps in vitamin B12, calcium, zinc, and especially iron for women of reproductive age, where the iron requirements are increased considerably. And so we really have to be careful when we get too low with animal source foods, especially at the population level. We start running into risk of adequacy for some of these nutrients. So when we think about sustainable diets, why are those important? Well, it's very clear that food systems have a large environmental impact. 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions caused by humans are coming from food systems. Over 2/3 of the freshwater withdrawals come from food systems. And then most importantly, probably, is the species extinction, where we see vast amounts of species have already been extinct through food systems, often through the conversion of natural ecosystems to agricultural land. And that happens still today, and so it's a huge issue. Now, what do we do about it? The first thing is really important, is to really reduce the amount of food lost or wasted. And so in a lot of regions where infrastructure and technology is not as available, we see a lot of food lost on farm or in transit. If we don't have cold storage, a lot of food loss can happen in that part of the supply chain. Now, a lot of food is wasted in contrast in higher income context at the household level and at restaurants and things like that. So huge efforts are needed to reduce this. This is just a third of the food we produce is lost or wasted. So at the same time, it's really important to boost production efficiency. So all else being equal, the more product you have per input, the more efficient that is. So the more you're getting out of the same environmental impact, assuming that you can do that without reducing, the risk, without increasing the risk of other harmful things in the environment, which we'll talk about. So when we're doing this, reducing food waste and loss, we want to increase efficiency. We also want to think about the more holistic system of all of the biodiversity on farm, the genetic resources, how resilient are these agroecosystems to increasing climate shocks, for example, weather shocks, and other things like cultural heritage. So we really want to think a bit more holistically than just efficiency, which is an important focus, but not at the expense of biodiversity and other important ecosystem services. And so when we're thinking about how to do that, one way is through circular approaches where we can really make use as this example shows for livestock, if you have crop residues or byproducts or co-products from crops that you're really recycling through ruminants, for example, making use of pasture or range lands that are not suitable for cropland. That's another use. So there are these potential ways to enhance the positive aspects of food production through circular approaches that really encourage biodiversity on the agroecosystems, potentially combining crops and livestock on the same farm, things like that. So really, when we're looking at sustainable diets, they certainly need to be plant-rich, but we can't forget micronutrients. And there is a risk when we go too low in animal source foods that we make it harder to get all the essential nutrients for health. And so we have to pay attention to that and really look at it from a few different angles. So the ideal way to get our nutrients is typically through food. And so where people can access diverse foods of animal and plant sources, it's really important, really trying to get diets to contain most of the nutrients that we need through these intrinsic sources of nutrients. Now, fortification is also essential as a safety net. A lot of people can't afford a healthy diet. We know about 3 billion people worldwide are unable to afford a healthy diet. So it's critical to have fortifications so that we can protect those who are in most need of nutrition. And other forms of fortification like salt iodization are also really important. And that's because food sources of iodine are inconsistent because they depend on the soil content of iodine. So fortification is a really steady way to ensure adequate iodine intake. Now, biofortification, or also sometimes called nutrient-enriched crops, really are a really good strategy because they don't rely on adding fortification or fortified nutrients after the fact, but they actually breed the increased nutrient content or improved bioavailability into the crops themselves. So when the consumer gets the food, it already contains higher nutrient content. So orange flesh, sweet potato, high iron maize or beans are examples of this. And then lastly, it's still important to have access to supplementation. And this is particularly important during critical life stages that have a large consequence if there's deficiencies like pregnancy and lactation, during infancy and early childhood. And so when increased nutrient requirements are happening during these phases, supplementation can be a really key strategy to get all of the nutrient needs met. So to conclude, we really see widespread malnutrition, looking in at micronutrient deficiencies, inadequacies, more than half of the population globally are lacking at least one and oftentimes multiple micronutrients. So they're much higher, these deficiencies, in the lower income context, as we saw in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but they're still common even in higher income countries. So it's very clear that our food systems are not providing adequate diets. Now, the reason for that varies depending on the context. So as we can see in higher income countries, we saw that ultra-processed or unhealthy, nutrient-poor foods are displacing the more nutrient-rich foods. And in lower income context, we really have diets that are dominated by starchy staples, and they lack diversity because people cannot afford healthy, diverse diets. It's very clear when we look at achieving micronutrient adequacy that food systems need to produce a diversity of plant and animal source foods. When we go too low in animal source foods, we really limit the ability to get all of our nutrient needs met. Now, to produce food sustainably, we need to do a variety of things like produce efficiency, cut food loss and waste, but we can't do that at the expense of other environmental issues. So we want, different approaches like agrobiodiversity and circular agroecosystems. So it doesn't have to be the same approach everywhere, but it's important to consider the full suite of sustainable components of food systems. So overall, we know that sustainable diets should be plant-rich, but they need to be nutrient adequate. And so we really want to make sure they're balanced. And lastly, we need to pursue all of these efforts at once to ensure that everyone can get access to the nutrition they need. So this includes dietary change, fortification, biofortification, and supplementation. Thank you, and happy to answer questions and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Taideal. Dear Holt, I forgot to introduce to the Dr. Bill. Please excuse me. I will read his biography now. Dr. Till Bill is head of Food System Data and Analytics at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, positioned about translating complex research into actionable insight. He brings an interdisciplinary background in global nutrition, public health, epidemiology, and food systems. His research examines how diet quality, micronutrients, animal source foods, and food processing influence in human health, nutrition, and non-communicable disease. With work published in leading journals and covered by prominent news outlets, Dr. Bill serves on UN expert advisor groups, including WHO, FAO, and UNICEF Committee to Accessible Science. He speaks at international conference and webinar and engaged audience throughout its blogs, podcasts, and social media, driven by a vision of healthy, sustainable diet for all. His research creates understanding population. Dr. Bill holds a PhD from the University of California, Davis. Thank you very much, Dr. Bill, for your exposition. Now we have the conference of the Professor Hassan Baden-Parast, Nutritional Difference Between Milk and Plant-Based Beverage. Dr. Hassan is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, with joint appointments in the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition and School of Public Health. His research focuses on nutrition and sociocultural determinants of health, particularly among marginalized populations such as newcomers, indigenous community, and children. Dr. Baden-Parast has a global reach in his research and health promotion initiative, collaborating with numerous international organizations. As a nutritional epidemiologist, he investigates the role of diet in disease prevention, with extensive research of the role of dairy in optimal growth and development. Throughout the research, Dr. Baden-Parast has noted the sustainable switch in dairy consumption control the life course and over the last few decades, and recognized the trending movement towards plant-based dairy alternatives. Dr. Baden-Parast, thank you very much for collaborate with us in this symposium.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hassan Batamparas, and I have a pleasure to talk about nutritional variabilities and public health implications between milk and plant source beverages. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me for this event. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge my co-presenter, Ms. Zoe Langworth, our lab manager, who's going to be available in online session for addressing any questions. Also, I'd like to acknowledge my lab members. I'll be presenting some information from our book that is going to be published very soon in June on plant-based alternative and human health, current trends, nutrition, and public health implications. That's why I have the co-authors' names in here. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the founders, Dairy Farmers Canada, and also Canadian Institute of Health Research, who funded our projects. And also, I live in Treaty 6 territory in province of Saskatchewan in Canada, and I respect the ancestors in this land. Well, on what you see in this slide on the top left, we see Canadian Food Guide in 2019 published, and then Planetary Health Diet, it Lancet in 2019. You see the similarities, and also Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. So what is common in all three is that we don't see milk and alternative as a standalone food group the way that we used to see for decades. As much as our society moves toward plant-based diet, understanding the nutritional differences between dairy and their alternative counterparts is crucial to support population health. That's why we have this talk. I'm going to be quickly going to plant source beverages. After that, population and consumption trends, then nutritional values between the two, nutritional evaluation of plant source beverages versus dairy, and then main public health concerns and future opportunities. You are all familiar with plant source beverages. They are considered as alternative for milk. They mimic the appearance and texture of milk, and that's what they are relying on. They are coming from different sources, cereal-based like oat, rice, legume-based like soy, and then nut-based like almond, seed-based like hemp, flax, and then also pseudo-cereal based like quinoa. This is the study that we published in 2020 comparing Canadian children and adults, their patterns of intake, dairy products and plant source beverages in 2004 and 2015, looking into what's the main differences. In the charts that you see, milk consumers, non-consumers, and then the green is plant source beverage consumers, and then non-consumers. If you look at the demographics, you see that in 2004, there is no really that much difference. Significant difference comes to ethnicity, the same story, percent-wide is the ethnicity. We see that there's not that much difference. In terms of overweight, obviously, again, no significant difference. When it comes to 2015, we see that the trend starts in white ethnicity, significantly higher number of them, they consume plant source beverages. Now, if you go to adults, what is happening in 2004, that most those who are consuming plant source beverages are women, 65%. Now, when it comes to 2015, there is no significant difference. It means that men also have the trend toward plant source beverages. In 2015, another significant factor that we see is that the age of those who are milk consumers is significantly higher than age. They are older than those who are plant-based consumers by around maybe six years difference. So what we have noticed in Canada, significant decrease in percent of Canadians consuming milk from 70% to 56% from 2004 to 2015. At the same time, significant increase in plant source beverages from 1.8, almost doubled, 3%. In 2022, the sales of plant source beverages in Canada was around $519 million. On the right side, you see the per capita data, milk available for consumption in Canada, the decline, how it's decreasing, and it's a sharp decrease from 2021 to 2023 when we have data available. What is happening in the United States, still cost milk in terms of volume makes up to 85% of annual milk and alternative consumption. Plant source beverage contribute to 8% by 2017, 2019. And during those time, milk have decreased on average $465 million per year. At the same time, plant-based beverages increased by 123 million per year. And say, imagine if the market for plant-sourced beverages was 2.69 billion in 2021, it's going to be increasing by around 7.95 billion by 2023. On the right side, you see how per capita cow's milk consumption, cups per person per day, has significantly decreased from 1970s to 2019. Interestingly, on the other side, we see that Europe is still, unlike North America, milk consumption remains relatively stable. But at the same time, 23% of consumers state that they purchase plant-based sources on their regular trips to grocery store. You see up and downs from 1970s going up, and then in 2000, there's a sharp decline. In 2020, it's picking up. Here is an interesting diagram that shows from 1961 to 22 what is happening in terms of consumption. The darker the color on the screen on the countries, the more consumption. I'm going to play it. As you see, say, just focusing on your country of interest for us in Canada, up and down patterns, and then compared to 1961, the consumption is less. Now, when it comes to consumption volume of top 10 milk and plant-sourced beverage consuming nations, this is from our book. You see that Finland, traditionally known for high dairy consumption, it has a considerable decline from 2020 onward, and then a stability from 22 to 23. And what is concerning at the same time, this is the blue line that relates to Finland on plant-sourced beverage to see how rapidly it's increasing from 2018 to 2023. Nutritional and health values, let's talk about that. Dairy products, again, this is another part of our book. Dairy products provide a good source of calcium, potassium, vitamin D fortified, and protein. These are facts that you know. We did umbrella review of meta-analysis from different systematic review. We noticed that milk is associated with 4 to 10% lower risk of cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, stroke, and hypertension. This study is in the process of publication. One of our colleagues published in 2021 that milk consumption may be associated with higher risk of prostate cancer, Parkinson's disease, and acne. This is another thing that needs to be considered. Now, when it comes to plant-sourced beverages, there are many factors having impact on nutritional contribution of plant-sourced beverages, so type of products and ingredients. The challenge that we have with plant-sourced beverages, numerous substrates, a diverse array of substrate that is used for making them. And also at the top of that, they are adding various additives to increase shelf life, mouthfeel, taste, and texture. Common additions to commercialize plant-sourced beverages. I put this table in here. I'm not going to be going through all of it, but they need to have acidity regulator, stabilizer, oil, and thicknesser, and preservatives, flavoring, and also vitamin minerals. The purpose is giving that texture and feeling of milk, and at the same time increasing shelf life, as I mentioned, and adding vitamin minerals that they don't have. You are familiar with NOVA categories of food processing, and in general, I put this table as a reminder. So NOVA 1 is unprocessed, and NOVA 4 is ultra-processed food, and you see the examples in here. The challenge that we have with plant-sourced beverage that they vary across different categories of NOVA. Imagine traditionally in countries like China or other countries that they were using plant-sourced beverage, homemade plant-sourced beverage. They were soaking, extracting, and doing filtration, and that untreated plant-sourced beverage was in NOVA category 1, not that much of risk. But when processing starts, heating and packaging is entering, and then formulation, and then adding additives and sugar, moving toward NOVA 3, NOVA 4. This is another chapter of our textbook looking into regulations across different countries. We have seen that some nations, they have included plant-based sources in dietary guidelines. As a part of healthy diet, you see Canada, United States, and the countries that in this map are in green are the ones that are included, and minimally discussed in the ones that are in yellow, and then the one in gray not included. So it's very interesting to see that among those who have guidelines, Belgium is a country that excluded beverages as when they are enriched, their nutritional similarities does not imply that they have the same health benefit as dairy. It's a very good note that I have seen in Belgian guidelines. Fortification requirements varies across different countries, but Canada, United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Qatar, they have emphasized the importance of fortification in their guidelines. Now let's talk about the nutritive values and bioavailabilities. If we put aside the additives that plant-source beverages have, they may have some bioactive components like polyphenols and carotenoids, vitamins, omega-3, and so on. Depends on the source that they have. Like almond beverages, they have alpha-tocopherolflavonoids, flavonoids, and phytosterols, and so on, and they have health impact, lowering lipid profile and gastrointestinal health. Rice beverage, they have predixin, phytosterols, that they have impact on cholesterol, hypertension, and some other health outcomes. But at the same time, we should consider that they have anti-nutrients within plant-source beverages like phytate and oxalate. These are the ones that are much more common, and they are interfering with the absorption and has impact on the uptake, digestion, and utilization of the nutrients. So that's why we know that nutrients from plant-source beverages are less bioavailable due to the anti-nutrients that they have. So nutritional evaluation of plant-source beverages. Another chapter of our book is discussing the impact of cow's milk versus plant-source beverage on health. In terms of growth, we see that there are studies saying that it may support longitudinal growth in children. When it comes to plant-source beverages, there is a potential reduction in height of children due to consumption of that. In terms of bone health, it is well known that calcium, phosphorus, vitamin D content, when fortified, has impact on bone health, particularly in growing children. There is inconsistent results on osteoporosis. Plant source beverages, some fortified alternatives offer calcium and mineral content, but we don't have that many studies looking into the impact on bone health. Comes to obesity, whey protein may regulate appetite. The impact varies across different type of milk based on the fat content. When it comes to plant-source beverages, lower calorie options may help with weight management, blood pressure, and cardiovascular disease. We have some nutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium that link to lower risk of cardiovascular disease and blood pressure. Pulse-driven beverages exhibit potential to reduce hypertension. For type 2 diabetes, higher milk intake is linked to reduced risk, and slow-release carbohydrates in plant-source beverages in pulses may help in reducing insulin resistance. So now let's look at the nutrient content. The differences that we see in protein content is 3% protein, mainly whey and casein, and high-quality protein rich in essential amino acid. Comes to plant-source beverages, generally lower, except for soy beverage. That is comparable. Comes to fat content, 3 to 4%, mainly triglycerides, a small amount of cholesterol and phospholipids, and fatty acids. When it comes to plant source beverages, lower saturated fat and higher unsaturated fatty acid and polyols. And depends on, again, it varies, depends on plant substrate. Macronutrients for milk, at least 13 nutrients, different type of vitamins and minerals. Plant source beverages generally lower in calcium, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, sulfur, and so on. But there is fortified options that they try to mimic what exists in the milk. Vitamin D naturally is low in cow's milk, often fortified. We have mandatory regulations in Canada, and also plant-sourced beverage, they are low and fortified. In our study, we looked into percent contribution of milk or plant-sourced beverages to daily nutrient intake among consumers in Canada, and compared two national surveys, 2004 and 2015. The orange bar is plant-sourced beverage and blue bar is milk. As you see, we don't have that much significant difference in terms of percent contribution in some nutrients, B12, vitamin D, and iron. In calcium, definitely this is a bit higher. Saturated fatty acid is higher, total fat, and also protein is significantly higher. In 2015, almost in all groups, milk is higher, except for iron, that we see plant-sourced beverage is higher. In this slide, I like to show the most popular brands of oat milk, just giving you a comparative perspective. In North America, this is a Silk, and All-Pro in Europe, and also Cow's milk. In general, we don't have time to go through all items. The reason for multiplying by 2.5% to have similar volume as we have for Silk and also Cow's milk. In general, the calories are less in plant-sourced beverages or similar. Carbohydrate may vary, similar or less, or even higher, and fiber is higher usually, and protein content is less in general. And for calcium and vitamin D, they try to mimic what exists in milk. Almond-based plant-sourced beverage. Again, we are comparing Silk with All-Pro and Cow's milk. Almost similar story. The calories significantly lower compared to oat milk and also compared to Cow's milk. And then you see the distribution of different type of nutrients in here with the same principle to have fortification of that product with vitamin D and calcium, some vitamins and minerals. Now, main public health concern of plant-sourced beverages. What are those? Again, another part of our book is discussing the risks and benefits. If we replace milk by plant-based beverages, what are the risks that are posed? Cow's milk supports growth, metabolic health, cognitive development, and reproduction through life course. And then if it's replaced, there is concerns on nutritional deficiencies, children growth and development, and public misunderstanding that plant-sourced beverages have the same nutritional values as milk. These are the risks that exist. Comes the downside of milk. Say maldigestion and lactose intolerance. We know that lactose-free items are available, cause milk allergies. Usually they move away from cow milk. And there might be a source of foodborne pathogens and zoonotic diseases or contaminants. That's something that usually the health authorities need to consider, and industry is trying to be careful about that. So what are the opportunities that plant-sourced beverages are providing? The challenge is that the sources are vary, so we can't have one statement for all. It depends on ingredients and the source of plant-based beverage. Possibly acts as functional food based on the source that it has, and complementing high-quality plant-based diet as recommended in most recent guidelines. Now, what threats do plant-sourced beverages bring when they replace milk? Nutritional inadequacy or risk is a high concern for those who obtain a high proportion of their energy or their key nutrients from milk, such as children. So it's recommended for children to have milk consumed rather than plant-sourced beverage. Those who have stopped consuming dairy products, those who have low dietary diversity, and those who inappropriately perceive that plant-sourced beverages as nutritionally equivalent or superior to milk. And this is something that needs creating awareness. So what are the future opportunities? The plant-sourced beverage industry has experienced considerable growth through the significant investment in technology and consumer interest in plant-sourced diets. They are relying on emotional aspects of food and eating. Younger generation, they have concerns about climate change and animal welfare. In today's climate, the cost is another factor to be considered. So understanding consumer drivers and motivations around food is required for successful innovation, household penetration, and repeat purchases. What is our take-home message? For plant source beverage, we know that is growing multi-million-dollar industry. Target young generation. Use emotional and social motivation to support purchase. There are some benefits, but lacking long-term studies to look into the long-term effect. By no means, plant-based beverages are like milk, even after fortification. This is a factor that we, as scientists, as researchers, and as practitioners need to consider. Milk also is a multi-million-dollar industry. Thousands of years of history in milk consumption in human history. Plant-based, we should not forget that plant-based industry rely on that history that milk has to formulate similar products, provide at least 13 key nutrients with good bioavailability. So considering the current atmosphere that we are in, what are the actions that we need to take in terms of policy, practice, and research? In policy, unifying evidence-based guidelines across countries on milk and dairy consumption, and having balanced scientific view of risk and benefits of moving away from dairy toward plant-based sources, plant source beverages. In terms of practice, I would assume that there are dietitians in this event. Dietitians needs to support public's informed decision-making about the risk and benefits of plant source beverages and create awareness in the public. In terms of research, we need to have comparative long-term study looking into dairy versus plant source beverage consumers, what is happening in terms of their health. Also, future R&D for less highly processed plant source beverage options, and also studies on bioavailability. How is the bioavailability of the different nutrients and how it can be improved? With that, I hope you enjoy the event, and Ms. Zoe Langworth is going to be available in our online session to address your interesting questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hassan Badamparast. Now we have the next position, Dr. Molly Muleya. The title is Beyond Dairy, Evaluating Bioaccessibility Calcium in Plant-Based Source. Dr. Molly Muleya is an assistant professor in nutrition at the University of Nottingham since 2023. Before that, she was a research fellow for the INMANA program, Innovative Methods and Metric for Agriculture and Nutrition Actions, for 1 year, and 3 years for the Future Foods Beacon of the University of Nottingham. She holds a PhD in Food Science and Nutrition from the University of Ghent, Belgium. Dr. Muleya's research focuses on the dynamics intersection of agriculture, food science, nutrition, and health, with interest in the bioaccessibility, proteins, and mineral supply of food systems. To this end, she has published several papers in which innovative in vitro digestion tools, techniques, and research are pioneers to enhance our understanding on nutrient digestibility and bioaccessibility. Dr. Muleya co-leads the Nutritional Composition and Digestibility Labs at the University of Nottingham and collaborates on projects to understand nutrient bioavailability of food ingredients, particular plant-based and alternative novel sources of food. Dr. Muleya, thank you very much for collaborating with us in our symposium.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. My name is Dr. Molly Muleya from the University of Nottingham, and it's a pleasure to speak at this year's International Dairy Federation Symposium. Today I'll be sharing insights from our recent research that explores an important nutritional question: how do plant-based sources measure up to dairy in terms of providing bioaccessible calcium? As the global shift towards plant-based diets gains momentum, understanding not just the total calcium content, but the bioaccessible fraction, or the proportion that our bodies can actually absorb, becomes really crucial for shaping future dietary guidelines and food innovation strategies. So over the next 20 minutes, I'll walk you through the evidence we gathered, the methods we used, and the key implications for nutrition policy and public health. Now, let's begin with why calcium matters. Calcium is an essential mineral, most widely known for its role in building and maintaining strong bones and teeth, but it also plays a critical metabolic role, particularly in muscle function, blood clotting, and cellular signaling. Despite its importance, calcium intake is suboptimal in many parts of the world. Globally, it's estimated that around 3.5 billion people have inadequate calcium intakes, with the majority living in Africa and Asia, where dairy consumption is typically low. Here in the UK, data from the National Diet and Nutrition Survey show that nearly 1 in 5 adolescent girls and 1 in 10 adult women have intakes below the lower reference nutrient intake, or the LRNI, which is a level considered insufficient to meet the body's needs. The consequences of low calcium intake can be serious. They can range from poor bone mineralization and increased risk of fractures to life-threatening conditions like preeclampsia during pregnancy. This makes it all the more important to identify reliable and accessible sources of calcium across a range of populations. Dairy continues to play a central role in calcium nutrition, particularly in high-income countries where it accounts for approximately 72% of dietary calcium intake. This high contribution is due to both the high calcium content and the relatively good bioavailability of calcium in dairy products. For example, about 30% of the calcium in a glass of milk is absorbed by the body. To put it in perspective, a typical glass of milk of around 200 ml contains around 240 milligrams of calcium, of which approximately 72 milligrams is absorbed. And this is a significant contribution toward daily requirements. However, the picture looks slightly different in many low-income countries, because here dairy intake is much lower and calcium is more commonly sourced from cereals, grains, and leafy vegetables. These plant-based foods often contain naturally occurring inhibitors such as oxalates and phytates, and these can significantly reduce calcium absorption. So basically, calcium bioavailability in plant-based sources can vary significantly due to the structure and physiochemical properties of plant foods. This is why it is critical to evaluate not only how much calcium is present in these plant sources, but how much is actually bioaccessible and potentially bioavailable to the body. Right, at this point, I just want to briefly explain what we mean by bioaccessibility and bioavailability, because these two terms are sometimes confusing and sometimes used interchangeably. So on the left here, I show what bioaccessibility generally refers to, and refers to the fraction of nutrient that is released from the food matrix after digestion and available for absorption in the gut, and is basically dependent on the mechanical and chemical processes that are happening in the gut. Bioavailability now is on this right side, where you have your nutrients have crossed this intestinal epithelium and is referring to the proportion of nutrient that is absorbed and utilized by the body. So those nutrients could be in the circulation, where they could be participating in several metabolic processes, or it could be accumulation in target organs. And basically what we see is that as we go from the gross composition of the food to the bioaccessible composition, ultimately to bioavailability, you basically have a reduction in the amount of nutrient available. And this is why it is important to know what is bioaccessible and what is bioavailable for any particular nutrient in a food. So why is this work timely? Well, because we are in the midst of a global dietary transition. More people are shifting towards plant-based diets, often motivated by concerns around environmental sustainability, animal welfare, and personal health. For some, especially those with allergies or intolerances to dairy, avoiding milk is a necessity. For others, it's a lifestyle choice. Regardless of the reason, the nutritional consequences of reduced dairy intake need to be addressed. One of the groups particularly at risk is adolescents. During puberty, calcium requirements are especially increased in order to support rapid bone growth. At the same time, this age group also shows a high uptake of vegetarian and vegan diets. As plant-based eating becomes more mainstream, it is vital that we understand whether these diets can meet essential nutrient requirements, especially those of calcium, particularly for these vulnerable populations. With this context in mind, our study set out to answer some key questions based on this topic. Currently, we know that our dietary recommendations for calcium are largely based on gross composition data. So what we wanted to do was to evaluate the calcium content of a range of plant-based foods that are commonly recommended as good sources of calcium, and then assess not just the gross calcium levels, but the fraction that is actually bioaccessible in these samples using an in vitro digestion model. We then benchmarked these plant-based foods against a reference food, in this case, a bovine skimmed milk, in order for us to provide a meaningful comparison. We looked at whether typical serving sizes of these plant foods could realistically match the calcium absorbed from a glass of milk. And finally, our goal was to generate evidence that could help us to inform future dietary recommendations that are applicable in both high and low income settings. So, to assess bioaccessibility, we used a modified InfoGest model. This was modified in two aspects. The first one is that we reduced the contribution of bile and pancreatin because these reagents introduce a lot of calcium into the system, which makes it difficult to quantify the simple bioaccessible calcium. So to address this challenge, we applied a stable isotope of 43 calcium, and this acts as a tracer of reagent calcium and enables us to apply a specific blank correction for each matrix, and this obviously improves the measurement of bioaccessibility. So we start from the oral phase to the gastric phase and the intestinal phase, and at the end of this process, we centrifuge the samples using a 3 kilodalton filter that allows us to separate 3 fractions. So we end up with a bioaccessible fraction of less than 3 kilodalton and a fraction that is soluble but not bioaccessible as it contains high molecular weight calcium. And we also have an insoluble fraction which basically has solid calcium. And these fractions are then analyzed by ICP-MS, where we monitor for both isotopes, the native calcium and the applied calcium. So in terms of the food we analyzed, we looked at 2 different sources. We based our selection on articles and also on websites that people frequently visit when they're looking for guidance on calcium-rich foods. So we selected products that we found on the National Health Service site for the UK and also in some articles. And this generally had 5 different groups. So we have some cereals, which are important for low-income countries. We have vegetables, which are highly cited as high calcium sources. We have several legumes. We also have some dried fruits and others like sesame seeds and tahini that are indicated here on the NHS site. And of course, some plant-based beverages that are widely available now as dairy alternatives. Now to the results. I show here a table with results for cereals. Based on the gross calcium content, finger millet porridge, white bread, and wholemeal bread are higher or similar to skimmed milk. Bioaccessibility varied substantially, being lowest for oat at 9% and highest for white bread at 41%. White bread is fortified by law in the UK to replace losses during processing, and due to this high calcium content and bioaccessibility, it contributes bioaccessible calcium that's almost equivalent to a glass of milk. Although wholemeal bread had similar calcium content with white bread, it had half the bioaccessibility, so that resulted in less bioaccessible calcium per serving compared to both white bread and skimmed milk. Finger millet is a naturally good source of calcium, and at a modest bioaccessibility of just over 20%, only 1.3 portions are needed to be at parity with milk. We observe here that refined grains like your white bread, your polished rice, and maize porridge, they generally have a higher bioaccessibility than their whole grain counterparts. And this underscores the influence of food processing, which can reduce antinutrients and improve calcium bioaccessibility. Now moving on to the legumes. In terms of their gross calcium content, tofu clearly stands out, with values that were more than double those of other legumes and milk. Bioaccessibility was highly variable, ranging from 4% for tofu to 47% for peas. It is interesting to note here that having either a high calcium content or a high bioaccessibility does not necessarily translate to contributions made per serving. For instance, peas had the highest percentage bioaccessibility, but the total amount of calcium available per serving was still modest due to their lower overall calcium content. On the other hand, tofu, despite its very high gross calcium, had one of the lowest bioaccessibility, and this is possibly due to the chemical form of calcium that was used during its processing. These findings point to the nuanced role of food formulation in processing, the type of calcium salt that is used, and the solubility characteristics, along with the physical structure of the food matrix. They are likely to influence the extent to which calcium becomes bioaccessible. In terms of the vegetables, kale stands out with the highest gross calcium content of more than 900 milligrams per 100 gram. In addition to that, it also demonstrated a high calcium bioaccessibility, close to 40%, making it an excellent source of calcium, with only 0.2 portions required to be at parity with a glass of milk. Other vegetables such as broccoli and cabbage have highly bioaccessible calcium coupled with modest gross calcium content, such that up to 3 portions are required to be equivalent to a glass of milk. Spinach is not recommended as a source of calcium despite its high gross calcium content. However, we included it here for 2 reasons. The first one, to demonstrate the impact of oxalates, which are antinutrients present in spinach and other vegetables, and secondly, to demonstrate that our method is sensitive enough to show this effect. Indeed, bioaccessibility of spinach was less than 1%, confirming that it is not a good source of calcium. These results do highlight the importance of considering both the calcium content and the level of anti-nutritional factors present, which ultimately affect the amount of calcium that's potentially available for absorption. In terms of the plant-based drinks, we analyzed 4 different brands, 3 of which were fortified to 120 milligrams per 100 ml, which is what is on the label. Of the fortified drinks, the gross calcium was equal or higher than that of skimmed milk. However, in terms of bioaccessibility, none of the drinks matched skim milk with bioaccessibility less than 10%. This was surprising, but is likely to do with solubility of the chemical form of calcium, as the tricalcium phosphate that is used generally has a low solubility at the pH conditions of the gastrointestinal tract. The raw materials that have been used might also contain phytates and oxalates, which bind up calcium into insoluble salts. This slide highlights a diverse group of foods. It contains some dried fruits and seed-based products like tahini, or a product that's made from sesame seeds, which are sometimes promoted as nutrient-dense calcium sources. We can see from the gross composition that some of these products, yes, are good sources of calcium, and we can also see from bioaccessibility that some of them do have a high bioaccessibility, and some like figs and tahini have a low bioaccessibility. And when we assess per serving, we can see that none of the foods in this group come close to the calcium delivery of a glass of milk. Even the best performers like the raisins and apricots, which had a high bioaccessibility, would require 8 or more servings to match the calcium in milk. tahini would require around 250 servings due to its poor bioaccessibility. These findings also underscore the importance of considering both the food matrix effects and the portion size. While these foods can contribute to calcium intake, especially when combined with other sources, the evidence points to the fact that they perhaps should not be relied upon as primary sources of calcium. So to summarize this study, I have on this slide an illustration of all the products that we analyzed and showing here the gross calcium content per 100 gram. And from this graph, we can see that more than 50% of analyzed products are higher or equivalent to bovine milk. It is not clear why dried fruits like prunes, apricots, and other products like peas are also considered as good sources of calcium, because based on their gross composition alone, they fall a lot lower than skimmed milk. And we can also see why some of these products are considered in food-based recommendations or considered as good sources of calcium. Now this slide changes the picture significantly. We're looking now at bioaccessible calcium per serving. Only a few foods match or exceed skimmed milk. So you have kale, finger millet porridge, and white bread. These are followed by kidney beans, black chickpeas, and wholemeal bread. Unfortunately for tofu, despite its high calcium content, it performed poorly due to the low bioaccessibility. You also have the spinach and tahini, which also fall to the bottom due to high inhibitor content and matrix effects. And this result indicate that both the calcium content and bioaccessibility matter, and both should be considered in dietary guidelines. So now I want to highlight some of the unpublished work we have been doing most recently to follow up on some of the results we found in the previous study. A particular interest relates to the plant-based drinks. So we did an exploration of about 25 plant-based beverages that are available on the UK market, and we considered beverages based on almond, coconut, oats, and soya. And what we did was to do almost a similar thing as we did in the previous analysis, where we're looking at the gross calcium composition and the bioaccessibility of these beverages. First, we can see from the dry matter contents of these products that this varies significantly. If we consider that skimmed milk has about 10% dry matter, we can see that a large amount of these products actually have a dry matter composition which is lower than 10%. And when we look at the calcium concentration per 100 grams of product, we can see that a lot of the products are above the 120 milligrams per ml that is expected, or that they are fortified to reach to be almost equal to that of skim milk. But we also find very strangely that for some products they're actually below the 120 milligram per ml that is labeled on the product, and it is not very clear why this is so. I have to point out that these products were shaken very carefully, because we know that some of the calcium that is added to these products actually precipitates, but it is not clear why some of the products fall below the 120 milligrams per ml that is expected and that's labeled on the product. So here I show the bioaccessibility results for the plant-based beverages we analyzed. The green columns show the bioaccessible calcium, and the purple columns show the soluble but not bioaccessible calcium. The red dotted line is the bioaccessibility of milk, which is at 30%, indicating the target if these drinks are to be at parity with milk. Almost all the drinks had a bioaccessibility of less than 10%, and when we consider the soluble fraction, this was lower than 15% in most cases, suggesting that for most of these drinks, the majority of calcium does not solubilize at the conditions of the gastrointestinal tract. We think potential mechanisms causing this poor solubility and bioaccessibility is related to the factors I already mentioned, which includes the solubility of the chemical form of calcium that's used in the plant matrix, the presence of phytate and oxalates in the raw materials, which are likely to be more reactive as they will already be dispersed in solutions, and the possible interaction with various additives commonly associated with these products, such as the soluble fibers and stabilizers. This means that there is an urgent need for more targeted and systematic research to understand the mechanisms involved and to develop a clear guidance for best practices of fortification for these products. So what are the implications of these findings for public health? Firstly, we think dietary guidelines must consider not just the gross nutrient content, but also bioavailability. I think I've demonstrated that with all the evidence that we have presented, because we've seen that foods that are high in calcium on paper may not actually deliver much in practice. Second, we need more evidence-based regulation of fortification practices, especially in plant-based dairy alternatives, as we have seen that simply adding calcium is not enough if the form that is used is not bioaccessible or if the matrix itself contains inhibitory compounds. And what we can also say about the data we presented is that there are some populations that would be at risk from low calcium intake, and this includes people who are on vegan diets, adolescents, particularly young girls, and some vulnerable groups in low-income countries who have limited access to dairy foods. This means that strategic food-based interventions combined with accurate labeling of foods and education are essential to prevent calcium deficiency in these groups. So to close, here are the main messages from this presentation. We found that only a handful of plant-based foods match or exceed skimmed milk in their bioaccessible calcium, and these were kale, finger millet, and fortified white bread. We also found that bioaccessibility is highly variable and should be considered in both food composition tables and in dietary planning. We can also say that fortification is essential for some products, especially the plant-based drinks, but there is need for proper validation, as not all calcium added is equally utilizable. And finally, we need more in vivo research to validate the in vitro findings that we have shown in this study, and this would be useful to inform meaningful updates to dietary requirements which are urgently needed due to the transition in our diets. Thank you very much for listening. I would like to acknowledge my colleagues and collaborators who are listed here. And I would also like to direct you to our webpage on the Nutritional Composition and Digestibility Lab, or NCDL, where you can find more information about some of the work that we are involved in. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Molly. Thank you for your very interesting exposition about the calcium and bioaccessibility. There's all, as we are behind schedule, we will carry on with the presentation. We don't have the break for 5 minutes, okay? So the next exposition is the Professor Susan Hodgkinson, transitioning to plant-rich diet, protein quality. Dr. Susan leads the nutrition team of the Reeds Institute of Marseille University. She runs both preclinical and clinical studies, including nutrition studies. She is also involved in studies aimed to validate in vitro, laboratory-based models of the human digestive tract. Her specific areas of expertise related with the nutrition and digestive physiology. Recently, her work has predominantly involved protein digestion and absorption through the gastrointestinal tract, protein metabolism, and the evaluation of the protein quality of foods for humans' diet. Dr. Susan, thank you very much for sharing with us your work and investigation.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Hodgkinson from the Reddit Institute in New Zealand. I'm going to talk about the importance of protein quality when transitioning to a plant-rich diet. I'll start by just reminding of the importance of protein, what protein quality actually means and how do we evaluate it. Then I'll give a bit of an analysis on the protein quality of different plant-based foods and talk about strategies to improve protein quality when this is necessary. As is well known, the lack of available protein in the diet can lead to malnutrition, and in fact, the lack of energy and protein are the main causes of malnutrition in many countries. This is particularly important for children who require a good amount of amino acids for growth, but it's also important to acknowledge that they have a limited gastric capacity, so they can only consume a certain amount of food, and we're going to come back to that a bit later. But even in high-income countries, there are more and more studies that are coming out showing that a proportion of older adults are not consuming sufficient available amino acids. This is critical for older adults as it can accelerate sarcopenia, which is the breakdown of muscle tissue, which then has important consequences for their quality of life. So protein quality is impacted by, first of all, obviously the food itself, its amino acid content, but probably more importantly, the amount of available or digestible amino acids, the amino acids in a food that are actually digested and absorbed. This will vary also depending on the amino acid within the same food. That is, within a food, not all of the amino acids will have the same degree of digestibility. It will vary depending on the amino acid. But at the end of the day, what we really need is a match between the available amino acids and our requirements. This part on requirements is very important because we are unable to store amino acids in the body other than as proteins. We will build proteins. The specific ones will depend somewhat on physiological state and require a specific amount of each essential amino acid to do so. Once one essential amino acid runs out as such, that is, it is all used up for protein metabolism, the remaining amino acids cannot be used. They will just be oxidized and won't be used for protein metabolism. This first amino acid that's limiting is the first limiting amino acid. So looking into protein quality, how do we evaluate it? We need to look at both the amount of available amino acids, but also their relation to our requirements. There are two different metrics that are mostly used to evaluate protein quality. There are others that can be in use as well, but these are the main two that we'll find talked about nowadays. One of them is protein digestible amino acid score, which is the main system currently being used in the US, for example. However, due to some methodological problems with this, which I'll come back to, there's another method which is digestible indispensable amino acid score, which is superseding PDCAS, with the expectation that DIAS will be taken up in the future. The predominant difference between these two metrics is the manner that the correction for amino acid availability is carried out, how the correction is done. For PDCAS, the correction for availability is based on fecal nitrogen digestibility determined in the rat. The problem with this are first of all based on fecal digestibility. As we all know, there are huge numbers of microbes that are present in the large intestine. These will metabolize all of the amino acids that pass through the large intestine, such that the majority of the fecal amino acids are of microbial origin, not dietary origin. Furthermore, there is no absorption of amino acids in the large intestine in a form that can enter protein metabolism. Really, from our point of view, the end of our amino acid digestion and absorption is the end of the small intestine, the terminal ileum, thus ileal digestibility. The second problem with PDCAS is each of the different essential amino acids is corrected according to nitrogen digestibility. As I've already mentioned, there can be quite a difference in the digestibility of the individual amino acids. And this is particularly so for the sulfur amino acids, methionine and cysteine, which quite often have lower digestibilities than the other amino acids. So foods which are limiting in sulfur amino acids will be overestimated using the PDCAS system. And the digestibility values are determined in the rat, which, whereas is an accepted model for the human, can be questioned if this is the best model. Then the amount of available amino acids is compared with reference values that reflect requirements. For DIAS, the correction for the availability of the amino acids is done on an individual amino acid basis using digesta from the terminal ileum, the last part of the small intestine. These values of digestibility can be determined in the human or using the pig as a model, and if there's no data for either of those, the rat can be used as a model. The values are then compared with reference values which have been updated since the PDCAS values, and these reflect requirements. There's one point I want to make about these reference values. There are 3 different sets of reference values. One is for infants, for birth to 6 months. These are based on the composition of breast milk and are to be used for infant formulas. Then there are reference values for younger children and for older children. What's really important here, because there's a lot of misunderstanding as to which reference values should be used. If a product or a diet is being focused for older people, elderly people, or definitely towards adults, then it is correct to use the older children, adolescent, adult values. However, most foods are also consumed by younger children, so for regulatory purposes, the recommendation by the FAO expert working group that was looking into all this area was to use the reference values for the younger children when determining DIAS values for all products other than those for older people. If we have a look at different DIAS values, first comment I want to make is the data I'm presenting here and in the next few slides are from Project Proteus, in which this project was between the Reddit Institute, University of Illinois, and Wageningen UR, and we determined DIAS values and digestibility values for a total of 100 different foods. For those that are familiar with the project, I'll make the comment that all of the digestibility data has been submitted for publication, and we expect to be able to have that out for public use very soon. Now, if we look at DIAS values of different plant-based foods, in each of these I've got the protein content, milligrams per gram. This is on a dry matter basis. If you want that as percentage, just divide it by 10. The DIAS value, and which is the first limiting amino acid. Sulfur amino acids are cysteine and methionine. What's really interesting is that plant foods that are based on soy usually have very high protein contents and very high DIAS values. Other ones not so much. Quinoa is the grain that we've found to have the highest DIAS value, and other plant sources then go from that. I've also included white bread here, as in a lot of countries the majority of protein is consumed in the form of wheat protein. The problem is this has a very low DIAS, very low availability of the amino acids in the protein. But the message from this slide is that the protein content in plant-based foods varies quite widely, as do the DIAS values. If we want to look at some isolates, so concentrated protein sources from plants, these are 3 that we have analysed. Potato protein isolate has a very high DIAS. Soybean isolate is quite high as well, whereas pea protein isolate has a much lower DIAS value. And all 3 of them do have quite good protein contents, but the important information is that even in the plant-based isolates, there's quite a variability in DIAS values. So what's the importance of this? As I said, proteins sourced from plants tend, other than the soy proteins, to have lower DIAS values and protein concentrations. So there are different options to meet your protein requirements if you are wanting to consume all these products. One is simply eat more of it. If it has a small amount of available protein, you eat double the amount, you're consuming double the amount of available protein. However, This will increase the volume of food, which is not always an option for children, particularly younger children. Will also increase the calorie intake. The other option is complement with other foods. And I'm going to talk a little bit about animal-based foods from the point of view that a lot of the time when a plant-rich diet is being undertaken, there's still acceptance to consume animal-based foods. If we look at the dairy proteins or the dairy foods, every single one, and this is just an example of some of the ones we've evaluated, they all have very high DIAS values and a good amount of protein in them. I've also added for completeness eggs into this table, which also has a good amount of protein and DIAS value, and some examples of different types of meat. So even with a plant-rich diet, a lot of consumers are happy to eat some meat, even if they're trying to decrease the amount that's eaten. So this is great, but what exactly do the DIAS values mean, and how can protein sources complement each other? I'm going to show you this in a series of calculations. I've simplified them down somewhat, but if anyone wants to know more about these, quite happy to talk to you. If we start off, the daily protein requirement for the adult, according to FAO, is 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. Just make the comment first that there is a lot of work that has come out more recently that has suggested that the protein requirement should be higher than this. A lot of it saying around between 1 and 1.2 grams of protein per kilo body weight per day. But for these calculations, I've used the FAO values. So if we have a 60 kilogram adult, this adult then requires 48 grams of protein per day. The first really important point here is that this is utilisable protein, not total protein. This adult will require 48 grams of utilisable protein. So we'll look at a couple of examples if we're going to say, okay, let's say this adult wants to eat 1/3 of their protein requirement at lunch, thus 16 grams of protein. And the example I'm giving here is the same as if you were mixing different ingredients together to form a product. So we'll start looking at, let's say, to get these 16 grams of utilisable protein, we're going to do it just eating peanuts. Not entirely realistic, but to give the example that I want to give. Peanuts have a DIAS of 48. They contain 28.4% protein on a dry matter basis and 97% dry matter. If we want to reach 16 grams of protein, with 58 grams of peanuts, we'll have a total of 68 grams of protein. But for utilisable protein, this needs to be corrected for the DIAS. So you'd need to eat 121 grams of peanuts to consume 16 grams of utilisable protein. Just going to add at the side here that doing so, you will eat 686 calories or 2,881 kilojoules. Now, let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Let's say we're going to have our 16 grams of utilisable protein in the form of milk, liquid bovine milk. In this case, DIAS is 105, 33.6% protein on a dry matter basis, 10% dry matter content. We can calculate that you would need to consume 470 grams of milk to consume 16 grams of protein. Since the DIAS is greater than 100, we don't need to apply any correction to this. So with a couple of good glasses of milk, you would get your 16 grams of utilisable protein. If this is 2% fat milk, this would give you 235 calories or 987 kilojoules. Most people are not going to want to just eat peanuts or just drink milk. So what happens if we combine them? The amino acids from one protein source will complement those from another. However, DIAS values are not additive. We can't just average the DIAS values between foods. This is because probably when we have two foods, especially if they're very different types of food, the first limiting amino acids will be different. So we can't just average the DIAS values. What we can do is determine the amount of true ileal digestible amino acids in each of the products, and this can be 2, can be 3, can be however many we want to add together, because the true ileal digestible amino acids are additive, and this has been confirmed in several studies. So I won't go too much into the calculations, but if we were to take 300 mils of milk, a good sized glass of milk, plus 50 grams of peanuts, we would have 24.3 grams of protein. The DIAS of the mixture is 73. I haven't shown the calculations for that, but it is. So if we were to consume that glass of milk and 50 grams of protein, we'd have 17.6 grams of utilisable protein. And if this milk is 2% fat, this would give us 433 calories, or 1,821 kilojoules. Thus, we can mix together different foods, and foods like dairy foods, for example, can be added to plant foods which don't have such a high quality of protein, and thus we can reach our protein requirements. Obviously, when we're putting together diets, we want to consider a lot more than just protein. This is just looking at the protein side, but there are, of course, many other nutrients that need to be considered. So the messages from this are, first of all, proteins sourced from plants tend to have lower protein concentrations and DIAS values. Therefore, a greater quantity often needs to be consumed to fulfill requirements, which is not always possible. Proteins sourced from animals, can be either meat or dairy, have very high DIAS values, often greater than 100. So mixing some animal source proteins together with the plant source proteins can help ensure amino acid requirements are met in a manner that's doable for the consumer. So if you're working with foods or ingredients that have a lower DIAS values, you can complement them with protein sources that are higher in the limiting amino acid. Okay, so that's the information I wanted to give to you today. Hope you have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Okay, goodbye.
Dr. Suzanne Hodgkinson, thank you very much for your exposition. Well, now the next conference is of the Professor Karina Wenter, Managing Cow's Milk Allergy in 2025, Milk Leaders. Karina Wenters is a professor of pediatrics, section of allergy immunology at the Children's Hospital, Colorado, and the University of Colorado Denver School of Medicine, where she is conducting research in allergy prevention and working with children with food allergies. Dr. Venter is currently the chair of the European Academy of Allergy and Clinical Immunology Works Group of Immunomodulation of Nutrition. She is also a member of the World Allergy Organization Diagnosis and Rationale for Actions Against Cow's Milk Allergy Guidelines. Dr. Karina, thank you very much for your help and your participation with us.
Hello, my name is Karina Venter. I'm an allergy specialist dietitian from Denver, Colorado, where I'm also professor of allergy and immunology. And I would like to thank the IDF for asking me to present at the IDF Nutrition and Health Symposium on managing cow's milk allergy in 2025 with a focus on milk ladders. Today, I will give an overview on the different presentations of cow's milk allergy, discuss individualized management of cow's milk allergy, and then also focus on the concept and application of milk ladder as part of the reintroduction process. So first, to give an overview on the different presentations of cow's milk allergy. So cow's milk allergy really is by far the most common and complex presentation of food allergy in early childhood. And many of the data and information I'll be sharing with you today comes from the World Allergy Organization, or the WHO, Diagnosis and Rationale for Action Against Cow's Milk Allergy, the DRACMA guidelines. I was first author on one of the guideline papers, and with this group of authors, we have nicely summarized the different presentations of cow's milk allergy. So cow's milk allergy can present as IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy, which is the immediate type cow's milk allergy, or the delayed onset cow's milk allergy, referred to as the non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergies. And so the immediate type cow's milk allergy can present with skin symptoms such as urticaria, angioedema, swelling, and rashes, GI symptoms such as abdominal pain and diarrhea, respiratory symptoms like rhinorrhea and sneezing, cardiovascular symptoms such as tachycardia and low blood pressure, and then also generalized symptoms such as anaphylaxis. These symptoms occur within minutes to 2 hours. It is diagnosed by taking a history and then testing for IgE to cow's milk allergy, specific IgE either in the blood or the skin, by performing a skin prick test. And when we can match the history with a positive blood specific IgE to cow's milk or a positive skin prick test to milk, we can make the diagnosis. Sometimes there's discordance between the test and the history. So we have a very clear history with negative test results, or we have positive test results and we're not very sure whether the child did consume cow's milk allergy and had a reaction, in which case we will be doing oral food challenges. We manage acute symptoms with antihistamine, epinephrine, inhaled bronchodilators, oxygen, or intravenous fluids very rarely. Dietary management involves avoiding cow's milk from the diet and will focus on individualized avoidance. And then the non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergies tend to be chronic and delayed in onset. So it could be eczema or skin rashes that develop over a course of a few days of consuming cow's milk. It could be children with nausea, emesis, reflux. The NESPACAN guidelines say that when we're dealing with GERD or gastroesophageal reflux disease, where the children have troublesome reflux, they may have back arching, growth faltering, irritable sleep problems, that we really should be thinking about cow's milk allergy as a possible cause of the GERD. Children can also have diarrhea, and rectal bleeding, or referred to as proctocolitis, is one of the classic symptoms of early life cow's milk allergy. There's huge debates about the treatment or the management of rectal bleeding, where some people feel the children should be left alone and milk should not be taken out of the diet. Often the children are being breastfed, and so we ask the breastfeeding mom or the breastfeeding parent to take milk out of their diet. In other cases, physicians feel that the consumption of milk during breastfeeding should continue, because children tend to outgrow proctocolitis within 3 to 6 months of age. Generalized symptoms of chronic cow's milk allergy can be poor weight gain or failure to thrive or growth faltering or stunting. The only more acute form of non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy is food protein-induced enterocolitis syndrome, or in short, FBIS. These children have projectile vomiting about 2 to 4 hours after consuming cow's milk. They may also have diarrhea. They can have the diarrhea the next day. They can have abdominal pain, but the symptoms are severe. They can get tachycardia, hypotension, go into hypovolemic shock. They may also have pallor and lethargy, but the symptoms are stopped usually by administering ondansetron, either oral or parenteral, and we need to rehydrate the children by placing IV with fluid to repair the child's fluid status. Dietary avoidance, just in the case of IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy, is individualized avoidance of cow's milk. And in both IgE and non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy, the children tend to outgrow their allergies by about 3 years of age, but in some of the more severe cases, they may not outgrow their allergy, or they may outgrow their cow's milk allergy much later. So let's talk about individualized management of cow's milk allergy. So it's important to talk about individualized avoidance. We are learning more and more that children with cow's milk allergy may become tolerant to cookies or muffins or other milk-containing foods before they become tolerant to milk. And this is the whole concept of the milk ladder, which I'll talk to you in more detail during the presentation. Also, not all children need to avoid foods that may contain traces of cow's milk or have food labels that have some statement about cow's milk contamination. We do challenges of 300 milligram of cow's milk protein, and when the children can tolerate this amount, then there's really no need for them to be concerned about avoidance of may contain labeling. May contain avoidance is never required in children with FBIs, proctocolitis, or GERD, or other forms of non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy. It may sometimes be required in children with eosinophilic esophagitis, which is also one of the presentations of non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy. So the symptoms I've already mentioned to you is the children with sort of like vomiting, reflux, growth faltering, and feeding difficulties. We need to educate families on label reading. We need to give them a lot of information on safe and nutritious food substitutes. So I spend a lot of time showing people websites with suitable foods. It's important, golden rule of food allergy, never eat anything unless you've checked the label. Website information can be out of date in up to 80% of cases. So if they order food they've seen online, they still need to check the food label when the food arrives prior to consumption. We need to talk about appropriate choice of infant formula or plant-based beverage. We need to think about establishing tolerance to baked milk, where we will talk about the milk ladder again. Cow's milk is by far the #1 food that's associated in terms of food allergies with poor nutritional intake and growth. So a child with cow's milk allergy, we really need to monitor their nutritional intake and growth. We need to teach patients and families how to identify and treat acute severe reactions. We need to think about lifestyle factors. Is it an adult that's just started a new job? Is it the student that's just gone to university? Is it a young infant that's just going to the creche or childcare? Or is it a teenager that's starting to go to sleepovers or school camps? And all of these things need to be addressed. And also, is it the family that's traveling to Europe or America or Australia or South Africa? Then we need to think about label reading and labeling laws for those particular countries, because labeling laws do differ across the world. And then finally, we also need to think about managing feeding difficulties, because once again, just as nutritional concerns, having a cow's milk allergy is the #1 food that's associated with feeding difficulties when the child have an allergy to that food. So cow's milk allergy associated with feeding difficulties. So then a child or an infant, young child with cow's milk allergy, if breast milk is not available to them, we need to choose an appropriate infant formula. And the DRACMA guidelines state that we can choose an extensively hydrolyzed milk or a rice hydrolysate, which could be partially or extensively hydrolyzed, as the first option for managing cow's milk allergy. An amino acid-based formula can be a second option. Soy formula should be regarded as the last option, ideally not in children under 6 months. And the main reason for driving the choice of soy formula should really be financial reasons. There's always the question about, should we use formulas with pre, pro, and symbiotics? DRACMA did not make any statement on pre and symbiotics, but in terms of probiotics, they do say that formulas, extensively hydrolyzed formulas containing LGG, can be used in infants with IgE, either IgE or non-IgE-mediated formula cow's milk allergy. But if you choose not to use these formulas, then that's okay too. There is a little bit of a caveat about using an amino acid-based formula as a second option or a second line management option for cow's milk allergy. And this is a busy slide, but I wanted to leave you with the exact wording because it took us many months to decide about the exact wording. And what we've said was that in children with IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy or in children with non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy, if there's any growth issues, then you may want to consider using an amino acid-based formula as first line, because in IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy, we've seen improved growth patterns when they use an amino acid-based formula opposed to extensively hydrolyzed milk formula. And then in terms of the non-IgE-mediated cow's milk allergies, we see that compared to amino acid-based formulas, there was reduced length seen in extensively hydrolyzed milk formulas. It is interesting that we don't actually have any of these statements relating to rice formulas in the sentences I've just highlighted. But when we look at the rice hydrolysates, Drachma states that there was no difference when comparing extensively hydrolyzed formulas, milk, to hydrolyzed rice formulas or soy. And again, with non-IgE, there was no difference found when comparing extensively hydrolyzed milk formulas to hydrolyzed rice or soy formulas. So it did seem that in terms of supporting growth, amino acid-based formulas may be the better option. So if we're not going to use an infant formula, then we may want to think about plant-based beverages. There's now many different kinds of plant-based beverages available, such as soy, coconut, almond, rice, oat, hazelnut, cashew, walnut, pea, sesame, hemp, tiger nut, and quinoa. The availability differ from country to country. It's important to be aware of the cost and to compare their nutrient composition against that of cow's milk. These plant-based beverages are lower in protein and energy than cow's milk, and often these plant-based beverages also need to be supplemented with calcium, B12, and vitamin D and iodine. In the UK in particular, the plant-based beverages are fortified with iodine, some of them at least, but we don't see the iodine-fortified beverages in the States. In terms of protein, some of the plant-based beverages have almost no protein, such as the coconut beverages and the rice-based beverages. And so often, another source of protein, such as flax or pea, is added to the plant-based beverage to increase their protein content. So again, I always say to the families, you can look at the type of beverage on the front of pack, but it's always important to look at the back at the ingredient list to make sure that you have a look at all the different kinds of protein sources in the plant-based beverage to make sure that you're not by accident ingesting a protein source that you may be allergic to. Pea is often an issue in FBIs, so coconut-based beverage with added pea protein is not a suitable choice for children with FBIs if they have FBIs triggered by pea. Fat content also needs to be considered when we look at these plant-based beverages. And so, we always used to say that plant-based beverages can be used in children over 2 years of age, but the latest Drachma guidelines, the paper that I'm the first author on, actually say that we can use plant-based beverages in children over 1 year of age, considering a number of factors. And so the factors to consider that may indicate a toddler is ready to transition to a plant-based beverages are that the child is at least 1 year of age. We really don't want to use plant-based beverages in children under 1 year of age. The child needs to eat a varied solid food diet with a variety of foods from each group, get at least 2/3 of their energy from their solid food diet, consume no more than 2 servings per day, or 16 fluid ounces or 480 mils of a milk substitute or yogurt. So if the child overly relies on their current hypoallergenic formula for their calorie and protein intake, it's not really a good time to change them to a plant-based beverage, we want to make sure that their solid food diet at least provide 2/3 of their energy before moving them onto a plant-based beverage. They should eat appropriate textures, get enough protein, fat, and micronutrients from their solid food diets, has no feeding difficulties, no known micronutrient deficiencies, and that the child has no additional food restrictions due to religious or cultural reasons. And so really what you want is a child that's eating well, no feeding issues, no nutrient deficiencies, and no additional food restrictions before you consider moving a 1-year-old over to a plant-based beverage from their current infant formula. So then to talk about milk ladders as part of the reintroduction process. So the ESPACAN guidelines talk about the fact that we take milk out of the diet, then we reintroduce it to make a diagnosis. And once we have a diagnosis, we avoid milk for some time, and then we reintroduce it back in the diet. And in both of these cases, using a milk ladder may be a suitable option. I'm not going to spend too much time going through the details of each, but the World Allergy Organization DRACMA guidelines also say that when we reintroduce, milk in terms of IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy, we can either use the milk ladder for reintroduction, or we can use liquid milk for either reintroduction or initial diagnosis. But when we do the milk ladder at home, it's important that we don't use the ladder in children with more severe type cow's milk allergy. So ideally children that's previously not had anaphylaxis or wheezing, and their skin prick test wheel diameter is less than 8 millimeter. When we look at the children with the F-pipe, which is the proctocolitis or enteropathies, you can use the ladder for introduction. We use that normally in all cases. You can use the liquid milk for reintroduction, but normally in a child with proctocolitis, when you have their symptoms under control, you can really start using the ladders to get milk back in their diet, and similar to the children with enteropathies. If you've never used a ladder, I'm going to explain in detail what they are in a minute. And then in children with FPIES, you can also use the ladder for reintroduction or the liquid milk challenge, liquid milk reintroduction. But because the children are at very high risk of hypovolemic shock, majority of clinicians still prefer a liquid milk challenge for reintroduction opposed to using a milk ladder at home. So then let's talk a little bit about ladders and how cow's milk allergens differ. So we have a number of different allergens in cow's milk. We have the caseins and we have the whey proteins, and they react differently to homogenization, heating, and cooking. And so when we look at homogenization, which sort of like removes the fat globules from the protein globules, it increases the allergenicity because the protein is now open for recognition by the immune system. But then when we go on to pasteurize or sterilize or bake or heat milk, we reduce the allergenicity because we actually change the conformation of the whey proteins, and we can reduce allergenicity by up to 80 or 90%. So we don't destroy the protein. We just reduce the ability of the immune system to recognize these proteins because we've changed their protein conformation or epitope conformation. And the casein proteins, we can reduce the allergenicity by up to 20 or 30%. And once again, it is not because we destroy the casein, but it is because we change the epitope shape of the casein peptides and proteins, and the immune system is less able to recognize these proteins. And so based on this, we have published a number of milk ladders. We've got the British Society of Allergen Clinical Immunology ladders. All these ladders can be downloaded for free using that reference. We have the MAP ladder, which is the first ladder I published in 2013. It has 12 steps, a lot of UK-based foods. Many people said, I don't know what a shepherd's pie look like. And unfortunately, the cookie recipes and muffin recipes contain sugar. And so people said we need a healthier ladder and we need less steps and we need international foods. And so we followed this up by publishing the IMAP ladder in 2017. We also published the milk ladder, where we try to test for the allergenicity using total milk as well as the whey and the casein test. But I think since the publication, we've learned a lot more about, the proteins in milk, and I'm going to show you some new updated information. We have the Indian ladder, still a little bit too much fat and sugar in, but it took us about 3 years to get the fat and sugar content of the recipes down. We also tested the total milk protein content rather than just calculating it. We have the Canadian ladder, which is used very successfully, but it is important to realize that there's at least a 10-fold difference between the allergenicity of a cookie compared to a muffin, similar, a waffle and a pancake. So I prefer ladders where there's 1 food per step opposed to 2 foods per step. We have the German and the Spanish ladder. So basically, if we can just take the IMAP ladder as an example, we start with a cookie, then a muffin, then a pancake, and so it goes. And what we do is we actually calculate the milk protein content of each step. And we start with very high heating, and then we reduce the heating time and also the heating temperature as we increase the milk protein content, so that we end up with a ladder that starts at least calculated lower allergenicity, and we work up with the higher allergenicity. And I will get back to the IMAP ladder in a little bit more detail. When you want to compare the ladders, we've also published this table in the paper, so you can see that some of them have recipes. I prefer the ladder with the recipes because it makes it a little bit more standardized in terms of at least the calculated a protein dose. You can look at the starting dose. So the IMAP ladder starts at 35 milligram, but has larger jumps than the MAP ladder, which is the 12 steps. So you can always go and cut the cookie in half or cut the muffin in a quarter to make the jumps less big. And you can also look at the end dose and whether we've actually tested the allergenicity of these ladders. This is another booklet that you can download for free from the American Academy Asthma and Allergy website. It gives you lots of different kinds of muffin options. It also gives you cookie options, and you can even build your own ladder by looking at the protein content of these different foods. Then in terms of ladders, we published the rostrum to stay that really nutritionally speaking, the ladder should be healthier. So that's why we changed the MAP ladder to the IMAP ladder. The IMAP has got no sugar in the recipes. It complied to the WHO standards of healthy eating. We have changed taste and textures. So in young children, you may need to actually mash up the cookie with breast milk or infant formula to get the young child to eat it. We've now got a number of culturally appropriate ladders. I'm also working now on a Colombian ladder. Ideally, recipes should be provided, and if we can test for the protein content, we should, and where information on protein content of commercial foods are available, then of course we can use commercial foods, but often it's difficult to get that information out of manufacturers. In terms of the food allergen, we really need very clear information on the dose. Some of the ladders just list the foods, but it doesn't actually tell you what dose of protein is in it. And so again, the ladders that I publish show all the different kinds of calculated protein dose, and some of them the tested protein dose. Specified time and temperature of heating, that's why really the recipes are so important. Test for allergenicity, which I've already touched on. It really needs to be simple. 1 food per step is really ideal, but if you have 2 foods per step, then you at least need to make sure that the protein content of the two foods match, and also the baking in the two foods match. So we've done that with the Mediterranean ladder, and we also take the role of the matrix into account, so we don't have foods with too high fat recipes. The Indian ladder probably has the highest fat content, but that is throughout the ladder, and so that should equally affect all the steps of the ladder. So this is the milk ladder analysis, and here we test for the BOS-D5, which is the beta-lactoglobulin, and we test for the BOS-D11, and you can clearly see that heating reduces the ability of the immune system to bind with the allergens to a much greater extent for the beta-lactoglobulin or the whey proteins than for the casein proteins. When we look at the amount of detectable allergens, and we've even adjusted it for recovery rates because we've also done some spiking analysis, you can see that perhaps calculated, the pancake should follow from the muffin. But when we look at the detectable milk protein, then the pancake should perhaps go prior to the muffin. And so we have suggested in a paper that's currently under review that perhaps we need to change the order of the milk ladder food. This is also true for the casein. You can see here that the pancake has got less detectable casein than the other foods. But in this test, we have actually only tested for a limited number of caseins, and we're currently doing an analysis where we have a larger number of caseins, and so we're waiting for those results before we actually do change the order of the ladder. But very interesting that, you know, this is the order of the calculated foods in the ladder. So cookie, 1, 2, 3 cookies, then half a muffin, 1 muffin, half a pancake, 1 pancake, cheese, yogurt, and milk, which is just standard pasteurized milk. But when we test it, the order still flows other than for pancake in both cases. Data from Ireland shows that really ladders can be used very successfully in young children. These children were introduced to ladder foods at the point of diagnosis. I'm highlighting this just to say that these were normal cow's milk allergic kids. They weren't necessarily a milder phenotype of IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy. The children were diagnosed. They were told to start the ladder. Only 2 children had reactions to steps above the ladder step that they were supposed to eat, but there were no suspected unexpected serious adverse reaction. But I do want to highlight here, the first line is by 12 months, 65% of the intervention group were at step 12 compared to 35% of the control group. This is fascinating that we can actually get children, almost 70% of children, to tolerate cow's milk within 12 months, whereas when we use ladder approaches, whereas in the past, we used to leave the children for 2-3 years before we would do a repeat challenge. So really, we need to reintroduce food, and we really need to try and get milk back right at the point of diagnosis, using, you know, the graded ladder approach, so we can get close to 80% of children tolerating cow's milk within 12 months of diagnosis. This is additional data from Ireland to show that 87% of infants with IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy successfully introduced cow's milk using a whole milk ladder, and the age range of the children were 8 to 26 months. Even this is data from Asia showing that, you know, using milk or milk ladder as a form of oral immunotherapy, which is also debated. The point I'm trying to make is that using a ladder is a way of getting milk back into the child's diet. And here you can see, even though it sort of like looks the wrong way around, the red line is the children on the milk ladder, and basically they were tolerating milk better, and they were more likely to have processed milk foods, which they really meant like baked milk foods in their diet, than children using other forms of OIT. And so really, you know, just to say that we know that ladders can be used successfully in non-IgE mediated cow's milk allergy where we don't expect anaphylaxis. FBIS is the only form of non-IgE mediated cow's milk allergy where we perhaps not want to use it. So favorable forms are all forms of non-IgE, not FBIS. We can use it successfully in children with IgE-mediated cow's milk allergy with prior mild reactions, so non-anaphylactic. Non-asthmatics is ideal, or at least their asthma need to be well controlled. Willing and prepared families when there's no language or comprehensive barrier. Families ideally have access to emergency services. High previous reaction threshold. So a child that's just reacted to trace amounts of milk yesterday may not be the best candidate for a ladder. Low or decreasing skin prick test. So if the skin prick test gets smaller, and younger patients are preferred since older patients may be more prone to persistence of allergy. So really, I cannot highlight enough that we're learning more and more that at the point of diagnosis of IgE and non-IgE mediated cow's milk allergies, with the exception of FBIS and the exception of children with severe type IgE mediated cow's milk allergy, ladders can be used very successfully to get a food back into the diet, which children really need to thrive, to grow well, gain weight appropriately, and prevent feeding dysfunction from following up. I actually published data from the Isle of Wight showing that if a child avoids cow's milk in the first year of life, they're still much less likely, even after they outgrow their cow's milk allergy, to have cow's milk containing foods by 10 years of age. And so it really, really is important to get children to tolerate cow's milk as soon as possible. And so in summary, DRACMA and Aspergan support the use of milk ladders for reintroducing cow's milk. Ladders are safe to use for milder forms of non-IgE mediated cow's milk allergy. The use of ladders in IgE mediated cow's milk allergy and FBIS should be carefully considered. They should be nutritionally sound, and the protein profile of milk protein in ladders should ideally be tested. And so with that, I would really like to thank you for your time. I look forward to the discussions during the question and answer session.
Well, Dr. Professor Karina Venter, thank you very much for your exposition. Now we have the presentation of the Professor Seishiro Aoi. The title is The Contribution of Dairy and Plant-Based Foods of Nutrition and Health in Japan. Seishiro Aoi is a professor and academic dean, chairman at the Laboratory of Nutrition Department of Food Science, Faculty of Home Economics, Otsuma Women's University in Japan. He has an extensive background in nutritional science, with key research interest in dietary fiber nutrition and functional component in dairy products. Dr. Aoi holds a master's degree in agricultural chemistry and a doctorate in science and technology from Chiba University, Japan. His professional career included nearly 20 years as a researcher at Snow Brand Milk Product, ENC, before transitioning to academia, where he has served as an assistant professor and professor at Otsuma Women's University. Leader in the field serving, he is an active leader in the field serving as a director of both the Japanese Dairy Science Association at the Japan Society of Nutrition and Food Science, contributing significantly to advancement in nutrition and food science. Professor Seishiro Aoi, thank you very much for your assistance and collaboration with us in our symposium.
I'm Seiichiro Aoi, a professor at Otsuma Women's University in Japan. It is an honor to speak to you today. I thank the International Dairy Federation for inviting me. My presentation is about the contribution of dairy and plant-based foods to nutrition and health in Japan. It consists of 3 parts. First, I will talk about the association of food consumption with cardiovascular disease and stroke risk. Second, I will discuss how dietary patterns contribute to the longevity of the Japanese. I will then review the contribution of milk and dairy products and soy products to other disease risks. I will conclude with the main findings of this presentation. This slide shows WHO data on healthy life expectancy at birth in Japan and elsewhere from 2000 to 2021. The term healthy life expectancy means the average number of years a person can expect to live in full health from birth. In the graph on left, in Japan, healthy life expectancy at birth increased by 2.29 years from 71.1 years in 2000 to 73.4 years in 2021. In the graph on the right, in the Western Pacific, healthy life expectancy at birth increased by 4.35 years over the same period, from 63.8 years to 68.2 years. Japan has one of the longest healthy life expectancies in the world. Why is this? Healthy life expectancy is affected by many factors, including race and lifestyle. Among lifestyle habits, dietary habits are important. I would like to talk about the effects of Japanese dietary habits on healthy life expectancy. This slide summarizes published findings from Nippon Data studies. Nippon Data is a national integrated project for prospective observation of non-communicable disease and its trends in the aged. A series of cohort studies were principally based on the National Cardiovascular Survey of Japan and the National Nutrition Survey of Japan. The baseline cohorts of Nippon Data 80 were participants first surveyed in 1980. They were residents of 300 survey districts throughout Japan, randomly selected for the national surveys by the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare. Information on dietary intake was collected through weighed dietary records for 3 consecutive days. Follow-up surveys have been conducted every 5 years since 1994. The top cause of death among Japanese men and women are coronary heart disease and stroke. The data shows that milk and dairy products and plant-based foods such as vegetables, soy products, including tofu, are effective in reducing the risk of death from cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke. This slide shows hazard ratios of cardiovascular disease mortality associated with milk and dairy product consumption from Nippon Data 80. During 24-year follow-up period, there were about 900 CVD deaths. This model is adjusted for age, body mass index, smoking status, alcohol drinking habit, and other confounding factors. The bars represent 95% confidence intervals. For CVD deaths among women, the hazard ratio was marginally higher in the low consumption group. The hazard ratio was 1.27. The hazard ratio for CVD deaths significantly increased with decreasing milk and dairy product consumption among women. P4 trend was 0.045. In men, there was no significant association of milk and dairy product consumption with CVD death. Therefore, the research shows that consumption of milk and dairy products, particularly milk, was inversely associated with CVD deaths in women but not in men. However, men consumed far less milk and dairy products than did women in this study. Furthermore, the levels of milk and dairy product consumption in the present study was much lower than those reported in Western studies, which observed an inverse association in men. A similar trend to women will be observed among men in groups that consume a lot of milk. This study examined the association between intake of tofu, the richest source of dietary soy, and cerebral hemorrhage in a general population cohort of Japanese men and women. Soybeans and soy products are traditional foods in many Asian countries, including Japan. During follow-up, there were 417 deaths due to stroke and 88 cerebral hemorrhage subtypes of stroke. Significant associations were found for cerebral hemorrhage only in women. Those who consumed an average of 43.2 grams of tofu per 1,000 kilocalories per day had a lower risk for cerebral hemorrhage than those who ate an average of 0.8 grams per 1,000 kilocalories per day. The reason for the differences by gender is not well understood, but may be linked to estrogen-like activity. Here are the main points of this Nippon data 80. From the milk and dairy products consumption data, the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality of the lower tertile of milk and dairy intake, a mean intake of 22.7 grams per day, compared with that of the highest, a mean intake of 168.3 grams per day, was higher in women, a hazard ratio of 1.27. No such relationship was observed in men. From the soy products data, the risk of death from cerebral hemorrhage in the highest quartile of tofu intakes was lower than that in the lowest quartile, a hazard ratio of 0.35, but only in women. Dr. Tsugane of the National Cancer Center notes that Japanese tend to consume a variety of foods such as grains, vegetables, fruit, fish, meat, and milk dishes, and that this dietary pattern might partly explain their longevity. His study shows that adherence to Japanese food guide Spinning Top encourages a balanced diet, and that the varied diet is inversely associated with all-cause mortality. Here, I look at the relationship between mortality and adherence to dietary guidelines and dietary diversity. The Japanese food guide Spinning Top is based on the dietary guidelines for Japanese, released in 2000. It informs people of the types and amounts of food they should eat each day to promote health. The food guide has 5 categories of dishes. Grains, including rice, bread, and noodles. Vegetables, also including mushrooms, potatoes, and seaweed. Fish and meat, also including eggs and soybeans. Milk and milk products, and fruits and 100% fruit juice. Soybeans are included in the fish and meat category due to their nutrient profile, high protein. In the food guide, the amount of food that counts one serving is defined for each category. One serving of a grain dish is composed of about 40 grams of carbohydrates. It recommends consumption of 2 servings of milk and dairy products, 200 milliliters of milk, equivalent to 200 milligrams of calcium per day for adults. This study examined the association between adherence to Japanese food guide Spinning Top and total and cause-specific mortalities. It was a large-scale population-based prospective cohort study in Japan, with follow-ups for a median of 15 years. Participants numbered approximately 36,000 men and 43,000 women aged 45 to 75, with no history of any of several diseases. If individuals consumed the recommended amount of servings from any of the 5 categories, or the recommended total energy or energy from snacks and alcoholic beverages, 10 points were given to that group. The score was calculated with formula shown. All group scores were summed to obtain a total score ranging from 0, the lowest adherence, to 70, the highest adherence. This slide shows multivariable adjusted hazard ratios of mortality according to scores of the Japanese Food Guide. On the left, we see total mortality, and on the right, cardiovascular mortality. After adjustment for potential confounding variables, higher Food Guide scores were found to be associated with lower total mortality. Multivariable adjusted hazard ratios of total mortality for the lowest through highest 4 scores were 1.00, 0.92, 0.88, 0.85. P4 trend was less than 0.001. For cause-specific mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality was inversely associated with the Food Guide score. The multivariable adjusted hazard ratios of cardiovascular disease mortality for the lowest through highest fourth category of scores were 1.00, 0.27, 0.86, 0.84. P4 trend was 0.005. The conclusion is that closer adherence to Japanese dietary guidelines was associated with a lower risk of total mortality and mortality from cardiovascular disease in Japanese adults. Next, here is the relationship between dietary diversity and total mortality in the Japanese population. This is from a Japan Public Health Center JPHC study. From 1995 to 2012, about 80,000 participants aged 45 to 74 years were followed up for a median of 14.9 years. A total of 133 foods and beverages were listed on the 5-year follow-up food frequency questionnaire, and the daily frequency of consumption of each item was counted. The number of foods and beverages consumed per day was calculated. An inverse association was identified between total diversity and mortality rates in women. The highest quintile hazard ratio was 0.81. P4 trend was 0.002, but the same trend was not observed in men. This slide shows hazard risk of all-cause mortality according to quintiles of soy group diversity in men and women. This multivariate model shows that soy dietary diversity was inversely associated with total mortality in women. The hazard ratio of the highest quintile was 0.89. P4 trend was 0.004. But these associations were not observed in men. These findings, including previous slides, indicate that consuming a greater diversity of total foods and an increasing diversity of soy have considerable public health implications. Here is a summary of the main points of the contribution of Japanese dietary patterns to Japanese longevity. The Japanese tend to consume a variety of foods, such as grains, vegetables, fruit, fish and meat, and milk dishes. This dietary pattern might partly explain their longevity. In summary, adherence to the Japanese Food Guide spinning top and dietary diversity that encourages a balanced diet were inversely associated with all-cause mortality. Here we see the contribution of milk and dairy products and soy products to other disease risks. Frailty in older adults is complex, characterized by decline in multiple physiological systems. It is closely linked to disease risk. Frailty is a dynamic process with frequent transitions between frailty, pre-frailty, robustness over time. This study included 469 pre-frail community residents aged 60 to 87 years who participated in both baseline and 2-year follow-up surveys by the National Institute for Longevity Sciences Longitudinal Study of Aging. Estimated dietary intakes assessed by 3-day dietary records in each frailty transition were analyzed, with a multivariate adjusted general linear model after adjustments for sex, baseline age, years of education, annual family income, smoking status, and chronic disease history. Among 13 food groups, only milk and dairy products intake was positively associated with frailty reversal, even after adjusting for all frailty criteria at baseline. Daily consumption of dairy products may contribute to frailty reversal and frailty prevention among older community residents who consume lesser amounts of dairy products. Other food groups showed no association with frailty status transitions. This slide shows multivariable hazard ratios for the incidence of cerebral infraction according to dietary intakes of soy and isoflavone indicated on the baseline questionnaire. This study was of about 40,000 Japanese aged 40 to 59 years to examine the association of soy and isoflavone intake with the risk of cerebral infraction. As shown on the left, the multivariable hazard ratios for those who consumed soy foods 5 days per week, consumed with 0 to 2 days per week, was 0.64 for cerebral infraction in women. Before trend was 0.037. On the right, we see an inverse association between isoflavone intake and risk of cerebral infraction in women. The same tendency was observed in myocardial infraction, but that data is not shown. Furthermore, the inverse association for cerebral and myocardial infraction combined was more pronounced in postmenopausal women than in premenopausal women. No significant association of dietary intake of soy and isoflavone with cerebral and myocardial infraction was present in men. It was concluded that this community-based prospective study showed that high consumption of isoflavones was associated with a reduced risk of cerebral and myocardial infraction among women, particularly postmenopausal women. These results suggest that the consumption of dietary isoflavones may benefit postmenopausal women in the prevention of ischemic CVD. In conclusion, here are the main results of this presentation. The decreasing mortality rates from cerebrovascular disease are thought to reflect the increases in milk consumption. The low mortality rates from ischemic heart disease are thought to partly reflect high intakes of plant foods such as soybeans. Taken together, the typical Japanese diet, as characterized by plant foods and fish, as well as a modestly westernized diet, such as meat, milk, and dairy products, might be associated with longevity in Japan. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, Professor Dr. Seichiro Aoi, thank you very much. Well, I would like to remind you that you can get a certificate and of attendant or CPD certificate upon request to the mail address on the screen. Okay, let me see, please. Okay, if you need the certificate, As you can see, this FIL-IDF Symposium can account towards the continued education for nutrition professionals in Canada and the UK. Also, please note that South African practitioners can earn a total of 5 CPD points in completing the Signet CPD article. For the US, this IDF Symposium award 2.5 CMPEU is accordance with the composition of the dietetic registration. Okay, for the South Africa and the US, you need to complete some evaluation. Well, thank you very much, all professors that joined with us today. And now we have the questions for our panelists. Let me do the questions. Professor Karina, I have a question for you. According with your experience, could you talk about, let me see, please. Sorry, okay, Dr. Karina, could you give us a few details about the simple strategy to confront the allergy with the protein cow's milk in childs, and especially in child with less 1 year old, please?
So a simple strategy for managing cow's milk allergy in a child under 1 year of age. So I wish it's that simple, but if I have to really make it simple, I think, if the mother is breastfeeding, we always want to support that. Cow's milk allergy is never a reason for a mom to stop breastfeeding. If the child has symptoms of cow's milk allergy while breastfeeding exclusively, then we can ask mom to take milk out of her diet. And then if the baby is not breastfeeding, then, we can use a hypoallergenic formula, such as an extensively hydrolyzed milk formula or a rice-based hydrolysate, not a rice-based plant-based beverage, because, of all the issues, it has to be a rice-based hydrolysate, or we can use an amino acid-based formula, depending on what's available in the country. In some countries, I know, like in South Africa, for example, even though I don't live there anymore, I'm clearly South African, there is a use of soy formula also in some other countries because of cost reason. So if that's driving your decision, I would go for soy.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have one question more for you. Is upper gastrointestinal tea, bleds, bloody vomits, who are formula fed with no story of reflux disease in infants a potential cause milk protein allergy, or it's only in rectal bleeding, proctocolitis, for example?
No, actually, that's a very good question. So yes, proctocolitis, I'm first going to do that one, is often driven by cow's milk protein allergy. These babies are often breastfed, and so we have to ask mom to take milk out of her diet, or if they're on a milk-based formula, we have to change it like I've just explained. But gastroesophageal reflux disease, the NATSPGAN or the international guidelines now actually say that before we even going to try an acid suppressant drug, we should try a hypoallergenic formula or change mom's diet. So babies that reflux, where they're irritable, they don't sleep, they back arch, they have feeding difficulties, it's very clear signs that they have reflux disease, which is likely to be contributed by cow's milk. And so cow's milk need to be removed from mom's diet, or the baby's formula have to be changed.
Okay, Professor Karina, thank you very much. And this question is for Molly. Taking whey isolate protein as a supplement, does it have the same bioavailability and same absorbability as regular protein? Taking whey isolate protein with milk, is that a healthy protective for improving protein intake and promote muscle development?
Right, thank you. Is that
Is that question for me or for the protein, for the presenter who spoke about protein? I mean, I can have an attempt at it.
Okay. For you or for So?
Yeah. In terms of calcium bioavailability, there is no reason why whey protein would have a different bioavailability from cow's milk. We haven't actually tested that, but I don't presume there will be any reason why bioavailability would be different. So that's in terms of calcium bioavailability.
Okay. And other question, probably all can give us your opinion. Is better to compare cow's milk with soya beverage? Comparing cow's milk to oat milk or almond milk isn't appropriate? What is your opinion, T, Sol, or Molly?
Yeah, well, we have done such comparisons ourselves when we're looking at plant-based milk alternatives. So for soy beverages, they are considered to be a lot closer in terms of their nutritional value to cow's milk. In terms of the comparison, I think it is fair to compare them because all these products are being, they're being put across as alternatives to milk. So it is fair to compare them, and it is fair also for consumers to know the differences amongst these products. So I think the comparison is fair because of the way that these products are marketed. They are considered as milk alternatives and consumers are using them as such.
Okay. And with us is Mrs. So Lowgrounds, College of Pharmacy and Nutrition, University of Saskatchewan, Canada. Welcome, So, and thank you for your assistance here. So, according with this question, what is your opinion about this question, in especially considering the nutrition in infants or in adults people?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and pleasure to be here. Just adding on to what Molly said earlier, is it is also dependent on what the population is consuming. A lot of people do consume soy beverage as an option, but then there is an increasing movement towards almond and oat options as well. If we are looking at different populations, such as younger populations, of course, there's lots of very specific considerations we need to consider. Based off of the health needs of the individuals. If we're looking at younger populations, there are many concerns, such as those that Carmina went into earlier. But soy with the protein content does have some advances, but everything should be considered based on the individual health needs.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Tibio, probably could you help me respond this question? Due to fast lifestyle, most people opt for over-counter multivitamins, micronutrients pills. I want to know what are the dangers of using pills than eating healthy foods. What is your opinion about the improved diets compared with the multivitamins or micronutrients pills that use the people?
That's a good question. It's my view that the ideal way to consume nutrients is through foods that have intrinsic sources of those nutrients, and that's for a few reasons. The nutrients in those foods are bound together in a food matrix. So in general, there's a lot of synergistic potential benefits in how those nutrients are delivered, as well as these thousands of other compounds that are in foods naturally that play some role in health and disease. So ideally, I think there's a lot of reasons to consume minimally processed whole foods to get most of your nutrient needs. I view fortification and supplementation as a safety net, primarily, where we want to be able to provide people with nutrients regardless of what type of access they can access or afford. For supplements, these are particularly useful for particular life stages when increased requirements are present. So this is in early childhood, 6 to 23 months. Oftentimes it's very difficult to meet, for example, iron requirements, and so supplementation can be beneficial. For pregnant women, lactating women, again, oftentimes that can be useful. Ideally, if you have access to test, your iron status, for example, before supplementing, that's ideal because it's really not a good thing to have excess free iron. So you don't want to be supplementing if you don't need it. So in general, I think as much as people are able to access healthy foods and get most of their nutrient needs met, that's the way to go. Realistically, we know that 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. Almost 1 billion people go hungry at night. So there's huge gaps in what people can actually afford. So I think realistically, we want to have fortification as a safety net and supplements for particular demographics that have increased requirements.
Okay, thank you, Bill, for your answer. And I have other questions. And is ultra filtered milk as nutritious and bioavailable the nutrients compared with the regular milk? Molly, Bill, so what is your opinion about that question or your answer? Molly, do you have any answer? In my opinion, it's the same.
Yeah, I agree. I would expect it to be the same.
The best quality is the same, yes?
Right.
And other question, 2% milk, does it increase blood cholesterol and LDL cholesterol? I usually recommended 1% for skim milk, but many people like 2% milk better. So, do you have experience in epidemiologies and human nutrition about impact in blood cholesterol? Molly? Well, in my experience, the milk with the total fat content, no increment the cardiovascular risk, and especially when the milk is fermented. Okay. Dr. Muleya, in population that never consumed milk, post weaning or into adulthood, in Africa, for example, how did they get sufficient calcium? As does this indicate that calcium from milk can be adequately replaced with traditional indigenous diet?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, actually. So I think if we look historically at diets decades ago, we will see that they are quite different from the diets we are consuming now. I mean, when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, our ancestors had actually a very diverse diet, and that diet included a lot of whole grains and included a lot of vegetables. So we have seen, for example, some of the data that was presented by Ty Bell showing dark green leafy vegetables as being micronutrient dense. So we know they are kale-like vegetables that are prevalent in many sub-Saharan African countries, which are very high in calcium. And if you have low oxalate forms of those vegetables, those would be really rich sources of calcium. In terms of whole grains, I presented some data showing finger millet as being a very good source of calcium. And those indigenous diets were based on those kind of grains, finger millet, sorghum, pearl millet, which are actually very good sources of calcium. So they have a high gross composition of calcium. They have moderate bioavailability. So they make very excellent sources of calcium. We also see that in terms of processing, a lot of foods were processed in varied ways, and there used to be a lot of fermentation. And we know that fermentation reduces some anti-nutritional factors like phytic acid. It introduces things like lactic acid, citric acid, that can actually enhance the bioavailability of calcium. So if we're looking in the context of a diverse diet that doesn't include dairy, we can see that it is very possible to meet calcium needs. But when we look at the diets, the current diets we have now, we see that there's a lot of processed foods. They are no longer diverse. They are based on monotonous starchy staples, and these do not provide enough calcium, and we're starting to see those differences. So in a nutshell, I would say a traditional diet that is based on diverse food sources should be able to meet calcium needs without requiring dairy.
Okay, Molly, thank you very much. And I have other question, and I think Sue and Bill can collaborate with the answer. The question is, if we add plant-based and animal protein source in the same meal, aren't we diminishing the animal source bioavailability and absorbance? Deal, and then Sue, please.
It's not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that the inclusion of animal sources, because of the complete amino acid profile and bioavailability, actually increases the bioavailability of the plant source. So similar to combining complementary plant sources like rice and beans, for example, if you have one of those plant sources, like just rice, adding animal source foods to that significantly improves the bioavailability of the protein.
So please.
Yeah, just adding on to that, and my perspective is adding in the diversity of multiple different types of protein sources and foods does help complement nutrients from different sources, so could be looked at as a benefit there.
Okay. Is lactose-free milk as nutritionist compared with the regular milk? The answer is yes, but do you explain the details about this question? Because it's a regular question for us, especially in the clinical practice, no?
Could you repeat that question again?
Is lactose-free milk as nutritive compared with the regular milk? The nutritional value is higher, is compared with the regular milk, yes? Okay. For Dr. Bill or Sue, does the EAT Lancet diet take protein quality into account? Should it take this into account?
So, from my understanding, it was not specifically measured, or at least if it was, there was no presentation on the adequacy. But I would not be too concerned about it because the diet is very balanced in terms of combining different diverse plant sources and also including a moderate amount of animal source foods. I don't think the mean intake level is going to work for everybody. So I think for certain people, certainly they may want to consume more protein, but I think on average it's going to be adequate.
Okay, so and
sorry, nothing else to add on that. Bill did a great job.
Okay, I have one more question. May I have clarity on the Diaz calculation of combining plant protein and animals proteins? I think that question is about the mixed, the veggie and animals protein in the diet, in the regular diet, no? Molly, do you have any answer for that question?
Can you repeat the question, please?
May I have clarity on the Diaz calculation of combining plant protein and animals protein?
Oh, you mean clarity on how to do the Diaz calculations? I guess this is what they mean. So I do have some experience of calculating the protein quality of mixed meals using the Diaz calculation. And to do this, I think you can look at the FAO document on food. The FAO has a report where they describe how to do the Diaz calculation. And following this, I think, is quite helpful on how to do the calculation for mixed meal. So that document is quite comprehensive and has an extensive method on how to do the calculation.
Okay, and I have other question for you, Molly, and then I think, Sue, could you complement that? Maria Salergit said for us, Oh no, it's not this. In the context of a planetary diet published by the It-Lancet project, the amount of dairy proposed is correct? Should it be modified, considering that the scheme recognizes that there is some macronutrient deficiency? What is your opinion of you, Bill, Mulea, and so about the publication related with the It-Lancet project related with the nutrients requirement and macro and micronutrient deficiency in the people? That question is related with the It-Lancet diet, no?
I can start. In general, the amount of dairy in the diet is actually pretty high, considering it's a very plant-based diet. So I think if I remember correctly, it's about 250 grams per day on average. Keep in mind that Eat-Lancet 2 is coming out later this year, and so there will be probably a revision to these estimates and probably quite a bit more nuance. When we looked at micronutrient adequacy, there were some issues for some nutrients like B12, calcium, zinc, and iron. And the biggest challenge was for iron for women of reproductive age. And that's because the amount of phytate on the diet was very, very high. So at least 2,400 milligrams if you look at the average intake recommended for each food group. And so that really challenges the ability to get enough iron because obviously we talked about how phytate and other anti-nutrients can hinder absorption. So in terms of the adequacy, I think it's a very healthy diet overall. Still some concerns. It's not super easy in our current food system to get nutrient needs met for all life stages. So I think you just need to pay attention to, again, fortification as a safety net, potentially supplementing where needed, and maybe considering for some populations more animal source foods than were recommended as the midpoint for the Eat-Lancet.
Okay, so what is your opinion about that interesting questions?
Yeah, it's a great question. I agree with Dr. Beal that it is, it's about 250 grams in their recommendation. Now, this isn't a whole lot, but in the grand scheme of the plant-focused diet, it is not anything crazy. It does come down to this is a general guideline, and this is for a broad population. So when you're looking at what this will do for yourself or for your patients, it does come down to what is best for their lives. So I think that is very important to consider in some of these broader guidelines.
Okay, so thank you. And Molly, do you have any opinion about that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I think Zoe and Ty already answered it quite comprehensively. And I do agree that it does come down to individual circumstances and comes down to, requirements for the life stage. So in terms of calcium, I did mention the impact on adolescents and the elderly, that these have higher requirements. So depending on individual circumstances, this need to be evaluated depending with that context.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your participation in this interesting IDF Nutrition and Health Symposium 2025. And I think your exposition was very interesting for us and contributed in continuously shared the different knowledge about the milk and dairy product and impact in human nutrition. Well, thank you very much for assisting our IDF Nutrition and Health Symposium, exploring the role of dairy and plant source foods for nutrition and healthy diets. Hopefully we can see in the other interesting symposium organizing for IDF. Thank you very much. My congratulations to the old professors that share with us the knowledge about the nutrition and human health. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.